village of Chillingford had never seen a night quite like this. The wind cut through the narrow lanes as if slicing the very air itself, rattling shutters and whispering through the skeletal branches of the oaks lining the outskirts. Halloween was in full swing, or at least its chaotic masquerade had begun, but beneath the superficial revelry, a quiet dread had settled over Abernathy Hall. The stately manor, with its ivy-draped stone walls and looming turrets, had always seemed to sleep under a shroud of secrecy. Tonight, however, it throbbed with something darker. It was the butler, Mr. Pritchard, who discovered the body first. He had come to check on Colonel Abernathy after the annual Halloween toast, a tradition so rigid it bordered on ritual. The colonel, known for his sharp wit and impeccable health, despite his advancing years, had been found in his study, slumped over his ornate desk. The room was locked from the inside, the heavy oak door bolted and the windows latched. No sign of forced entry disturbed the immaculate panelled walls. The fireplace crackled quietly, its warmth doing little to soften the chill of the scene. Yet the most unsettling feature of the crime was a single, seemingly nonsensical clue. A small, hand-carved pumpkin, no larger than a teacup, placed delicately atop the colonel's chest. Its surface bore an intricate pattern of tiny holes, arranged in what could have been a smile or a cipher. Its presence seemed to mock reason itself, as if some mischievous spirit had orchestrated the crime. Inspector Lestrade, summoned from the nearest town, was a man of methodical precision, and he approached the scene with the solemnity one reserves for a cathedral. Yet, even he was thrown by the initial survey. The colonel's papers lay scattered, but nothing appeared missing. His safe remained locked, undisturbed, and his gold watch and signet ring gleamed on his person, untouched. No one in the household reported hearing anything amiss. No shouts, no scuffles, no suspicious footsteps. The guests at the hall, family, old friends, and a handful of curious villagers, had been dispersed throughout the grand rooms for hours, many enjoying the festivities, others retreating from the storm. All offered alibis as crisp and rehearsed as the collars on their jackets. The room itself was too tidy to hold the chaos of struggle, yet the colonel was dead, and the pumpkin remained, enigmatic and insoluble. It was then that Miss Jane Marple arrived, summoned by an anxious niece who had sensed that no amount of police procedure could unravel this mystery. Miss Marple, petite and unassuming, moved through Abernathy Hall as though she had walked its corridors every day of her life. Her eyes, sharp and patient, assessed the room and its occupants with a subtle but penetrating scrutiny. She observed the colonel's hands, still loosely curled, the ink-stained blotter nearby, the open ledger whose pages bore no irregularities. Then she noticed something that had escaped both butler and inspector. The pumpkin was not merely ornamental. Its bottom bore faint scuff marks, as though it had been rolled along the surface it now occupied, and a thin film of dust beneath it suggested it had been placed there recently. The pattern of holes, she surmised, might not be decorative at all, but intended as a code, or perhaps a misdirection. Miss Marple wandered the hall quietly, exchanging brief, pointed words with the staff and guests. The maid reported that the colonel had received an anonymous letter that morning, neatly folded and left atop the morning tea tray. Its contents were brief, cryptic, and unsettling. "Tonight your past returns. Beware the smallest faces." The message, she noted, was the kind of puzzle designed to provoke fear rather than provide explanation. The inspector frowned. Letters like these were not uncommon in cases involving the wealthy, yet the reference to smallest faces struck her as oddly literal, especially in light of the pumpkin. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts connecting invisible threads between trivialities others dismissed. The household was placed under gentle scrutiny. Guests were questioned about movements, meals, and odd encounters. Each account was flawless, rehearsed, and yet subtly incongruent. Mrs. Abernathy recalled passing the colonel in the corridor at 9:30, yet the clock on the mantel chimed 9:35 when she arrived at the study. A young cousin claimed to have been practicing his magic tricks in the east wing, though his fingers bore no signs of ink or soot as might be expected from such activities. The discrepancy was minor, almost laughable, but Miss Marple had long learned that minor discrepancies often concealed major truths. Hours passed, and the storm outside intensified. Candles flickered against the walls, casting giant shadows that seemed to mimic the very mystery the room contained. Miss Marple returned to the study once more, kneeling beside the Colonel's body to examine the pumpkin. She tilted it in the candlelight, noticing that one side had a subtle hollow, a tiny cavity just large enough to conceal a minute object. Inside she found a miniature key, ornate yet diminutive, so small it could easily have been overlooked by anyone not paying close attention. The key bore a monogram, C.A., an obvious reference to the Colonel. Yet what lock it might open within the vast hall remained a tantalizing mystery. The inspector, growing impatient with her quiet methods, asked aloud if she had any idea who could commit such a crime in a locked room with no apparent motive. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Patience, Inspector. Crime is often more a reflection of human habits than brute force or grand schemes. The smallest details, the things we ignore, usually reveal the culprit." Her eyes scanned the study one last time, resting briefly on the bookcase, where a volume appeared slightly misaligned with the rest. Pulling it forward, she revealed a small hidden compartment, exactly the size for the key she had found. Within lay a folded sheet of parchment, inked in the Colonel's unmistakable hand. The writing was old, almost forgotten, a confession of past misdeeds involving investments, disputes, and an unfortunate dueling accident decades prior. And yet the most shocking revelation was the intended recipient, a distant relative, long thought harmless, who had recently returned to the village under the guise of holiday cheer. The pieces began to align. The pumpkin, the cryptic letter, the key, and the hidden confession were all threads in a tapestry of vengeance. The murderer had not sought wealth or even immediate revenge, but aimed to unmask the Colonel's long-hidden secrets in a manner both symbolic and theatrical, ensuring the crime appeared unsolvable. Miss Marple, having quietly observed human behaviour, deduced that the killer was someone with intimate knowledge of the house, its inhabitants, and the Colonel's habits, a visitor whose presence had seemed innocent, who knew precisely when the Colonel would be alone and how to stage the scene to baffle even the keenest mind. By the end of the night, with storm and shadows mingling in the flickering candlelight, Miss Marple convened the household in the drawing-room. She recounted the chain of subtle evidence, the contradictions, the tiny details, each one overlooked by those who presumed to know more than they observed. When she finally turned to the culprit, there was no dramatic flourish, only the quiet inevitability of recognition. The murderer, confronted by the patient logic of someone who understood the human heart as well as its tricks, could no longer maintain the masquerade. The crime, though intricate in appearance, was resolved not by complex deductions or sensational discoveries, but by the careful attention to ordinary, everyday subtleties that often elude even the most determined investigator. As the household exhaled in relief, the storm subsided outside, and the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the tall windows. Abernathy Hall, shrouded for a night in terror and mystery, had returned to its quiet dignity. The pumpkin remained, now an innocuous ornament, a silent witness to a night where human cunning met the calm, unassuming intelligence of Miss Marple. And in the hush of the early morning, it was clear to all present that the true detective work had been done not with force or frenzy, but with patience, observation, and an unwavering eye for the small details that contain the truth. Morning light filtered weakly through the heavy drapes of Abernathy Hall, catching motes of dust in the quiet corridors, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The household had settled into an uneasy rhythm. The staff whispered among themselves, fearful of hidden consequences. Guests moved cautiously, uncertain whether civility would suffice to mask their own secrets. Inspector Lestrade busied himself with the procedural tasks he had long mastered, measuring distances, taking notes and checking alibis against the sparse records of the Colonel's day. But his mind seemed preoccupied with the more formal aspects of investigation, less attuned to the subtleties of human behaviour that often held the key to unravelling a mystery. Miss Marple arrived promptly, her presence understated yet immediately commanding. She carried only a small leather bag, and her habitual quiet assurance, and though she had already glimpsed the core of the crime the previous night, she understood that the wider context demanded careful observation. While others had concentrated on the sensational, the locked study, the cryptic pumpkin, the anonymous letter, She sought the ordinary anomalies, the details so easily overlooked that they masqueraded as trivialities. As she walked through the grand hallway, she noted the scuff of a shoe on the edge of the Persian rug, the faint imprint of a chair moved slightly from its usual position, and the smell of a peculiar ink lingering faintly in the air. Each tiny irregularity hinted at human action, and she catalogued them silently, storing them for later consideration. Her first stop was the library, where the Colonel had spent hours reading or corresponding with friends. Miss Marple observed the arrangement of the books along the shelves. One tome, a leather-bound volume of family histories, protruded slightly, as though it had been pulled recently and not yet replaced with care. When she eased it forward, a small slip of paper fell to the floor. It was a note written in a tight, precise hand. "He knows too much. Watch the hall when the storm breaks." It was unsigned and undated, but the handwriting struck her as deliberate and familiar. Miss Marple tucked it into her notebook, noting the timing of its placement. It could not have been there long, given the dust patterns she had observed, and it suggested premeditation, an unseen observer waiting for opportunity. In the main hall, the inspector had gathered the family and guests once more, insisting they recount every movement, every conversation, as if repetition alone could reveal the truth. He was meticulous, but his focus on mechanical procedure left gaps that only a patient eye could fill. Miss Marple noticed first the subtle avoidance in young Timothy Abernathy's posture, a stiffness that belied his casual responses. He answered each question with precision, yet his eyes flicked repeatedly toward the mantel, where a small carved owl ornament perched among photographs. There was something off about the way he lingered on it, a hesitation she recognized from decades of studying nervous behavior. Curious, she stepped closer, examining the object. Unlike the pumpkin, it seemed innocuous at first, a simple decoration of dark wood with carved eyes that seemed to glimmer in the dim light. But Miss Marple noticed the faint trace of wax, along one edge, uneven and fresh, suggesting that a candle had recently been affixed and removed. That small detail implied a movement or action in the hall late into the night, a moment when the Colonel had not been alone. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet in her experience such minor inconsistencies often exposed the skeletons of far more complex schemes. Her attention then shifted to the other occupants. Mrs. Abernathy's composure, so carefully maintained, was punctuated by a single tremor when the inspector mentioned the pumpkin. She quickly recovered, but Miss Marple's gaze caught the brief tightening around her mouth, the almost imperceptible narrowing of the eyes, a fleeting response that betrayed more than words ever could. Similarly, the maid Eleanor volunteered extraneous details about candle placement, emphasizing her diligence in cleaning, as though she wished to be seen as meticulous and trustworthy. Both responses were unremarkable on their own, but, when considered with the misplaced book, the wax, and Timothy's glances, they formed a pattern. Someone in the household was concealing information, perhaps unintentionally revealing it in the very acts meant to demonstrate honesty. Miss Marple then wandered to the conservatory, where a frost-tipped window overlooked the autumn gardens. The room had been empty during the initial inspection, yet she observed a faint streak of moisture along the sill. She pressed a finger gently against it and noted an unusual stickiness, residue from a solution she recognized from years of gardening, one used to clean glass but also capable of masking fingerprints. Someone had deliberately disturbed this window, she realized, perhaps to create an impression of normalcy, a false sense that all access points had remained untouched. It was an action both clever and flawed. Clever in its intent to mislead, flawed in the subtle evidence it left behind, which only a keen observer could detect. Returning to the hall, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the clock above the fireplace. It had chimed intermittently during the night, yet a careful inspection revealed that its minute hand was slightly bent, a trivial defect to most eyes, but significant to hers. It suggested that someone had moved the hands, perhaps to manipulate the timeline of events, to create a misleading alibi or a sense of impossible timing. Combined with the scuff marks on the rug and the displaced chair, it became clear that the narrative presented by witnesses required re-examination. Something in the sequence of movements was off, and only the smallest details, marks, residue, hesitation, could illuminate the true story. As she stood silently, Miss Marple's mind began to weave these strands together. The wax on the owl ornament hinted at nocturnal movement in the hall. The displaced book concealed a warning or instruction. The bent clock hand suggested manipulation of perceived time. The streak on the window implied deliberate misdirection, and the subtle reactions of Timothy and the staff indicated unease or concealment. Each detail was small, almost trivial, yet in combination they hinted at an elaborate orchestration designed to confound investigators. The full picture remained obscured, but the framework of deception was emerging, a lattice of human actions laid over the seemingly impenetrable crime scene. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had mapped the household in her mind, noting patterns of behaviour in the minute, telling deviations from routine. While Inspector Lestrade continued with measurements, interviews and procedural charts, she observed quietly, questioning not what people said, but what their gestures, hesitations and inattentive moments revealed. She paid attention to which doors were touched, which furniture bore traces of recent use, and which eyes darted in avoidance. In her experience, these often held the first real clues, far more valuable than fingerprints or formal records. Then, almost imperceptibly, she noticed something else. A faint, unusual scent lingering near the Colonel's study doorway, a blend of candle wax and faintly burnt paper. It was subtle, easy to dismiss, yet it resonated with the patterns she had already detected. The wax on the ornament, the displaced book, the manipulated clock. Someone had been moving not just physically but symbolically, leaving markers that might mislead an untrained eye while signalling a hidden logic to those attentive enough to notice. The scent was the first sign that the deception was layered, meant to misdirect at first glance, yet encoded with clues for those with patience to observe. By the time lunch was served, Miss Marple had already pieced together a map of likely movements and motives. The apparent calm of Abernathy Hall belied a careful choreography of behaviour, designed to appear casual while concealing precise, premeditated actions. She had observed the first signs of deception, not blatant but subtle, lodged in small disturbances and human reactions. And though the full picture of the Colonel's death remained incomplete, the first glimmers of understanding were forming, illuminating paths the official investigation had yet to consider. In a house full of secrets, her keen eye was beginning to trace the invisible threads connecting each act, each gesture, each item out of place. The dance of appearances and reality was underway, and Miss Marple was already several steps ahead, quietly unravelling the intricate weave of motives and opportunity. The mid-morning sun had begun to filter more insistently through the tall windows of Abernathy Hall, casting long shadows that slanted across the polished floors. Miss Marple, having already taken careful note of subtle irregularities throughout the household, turned her attention to the human element, the living witnesses whose words she knew could be as revealing as any physical clue. One by one, she and Inspector Lestrade assembled the household in the drawing-room, the air thick with the faint scent of wax, polished wood and anxiety. The first to speak was Mrs. Abernathy, her posture rigid, hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles shone pale. She recounted her evening in precise, deliberate tones. According to her, she had remained in her sitting room, reading by the fire, occasionally glancing into the hall to observe guests. She emphasized that she had not seen her husband leave the study after 9 o'clock, though she admitted to hearing faint sounds that might have been footsteps. She quickly reassured the inspector of her unwavering attention, emphasizing that she had remained observant throughout the night. Yet her eyes flickered once, ever so briefly toward the study door, a glance loaded with more tension than her words conveyed. Miss Marple noted the contradiction. If she had truly been vigilant, why had she failed to notice the subtle scuff on the rug, or the slight displacement of the chair, signs of someone's movement? Next came young Timothy Abernathy, his hands in his pockets, his chin slightly raised in what seemed a deliberate mask of confidence. He claimed to have been practicing card tricks with a group of visiting friends, laughing loudly at intervals, which would have made it impossible for him to approach the study unnoticed. He insisted he had remained in the east wing, yet Miss Marple's observations of the faint wax on the owl ornament, combined with its placement along the path to the hall, hinted at a possible route he could have taken. Timothy's eagerness to display his alibi, combined with the minor inconsistencies in his timing, suggested a desire to appear transparent, while carefully omitting incriminating details. Eleanor the maid was called next. She spoke rapidly, almost too earnestly, detailing every chore she had completed, from arranging flowers to dusting shelves, as though overcompensation could substitute for the absence of genuine clarity. She mentioned having checked the study door at intervals, asserting that it remained locked and undisturbed until the fatal discovery. Miss Marple, attentive as always, noted a slight hesitancy when Eleanor described the precise moment she saw the pumpkin, a flicker of uncertainty that betrayed either forgetfulness or concealment. When asked about the mysterious letter and the Colonel's recent correspondence, Eleanor's voice grew faint, almost apologetic, and she avoided direct eye contact, as though fearing to reveal what she knew. Even the household's longtime gardener, Mr. Hopkins, was brought into the room. Weathered and quiet, he spoke deliberately, recalling the stormy night and the rustle of wind through the gardens. He claimed to have noticed nothing unusual, though Miss Marple caught a subtle incongruity. He mentioned closing a back window to prevent draughts, yet the moisture streak on the conservatory window suggested recent disturbance. Either the gardener's memory faltered, or he had sought to obscure something. And if the latter were true, what had he been protecting, and for whom? One of the visiting guests, a distant cousin named Lydia Fairchild, had arrived late to the gathering. She recounted that she had been speaking with other guests in the ballroom for much of the evening, only glimpsing Colonel Abernathy briefly during the toast. She smiled warmly, yet her manner seemed rehearsed. When Miss Marple asked about the Colonel's habits, Lydia claimed knowledge only of what others had told her, speaking in generalities that suggested detachment. Still, there was a subtle tension in her phrasing, the careful avoidance of specificity that hinted she might know more than she admitted. As each testimony unfolded, Miss Marple quietly catalogued inconsistencies. The scuff marks, the displaced furniture, the wax, the faint smell of burnt paper, all these physical details now interacted with the words spoken. Mrs. Abernathy's overly precise recollection contrasted with her fleeting glance of anxiety. Timothy's exaggerated alibi seemed to avoid the hall entirely. Eleanor's hesitation suggested a buried knowledge. Mr. Hopkins' minor contradiction exposed potential concealment, and Lydia's vagueness hinted at observation from a distance without full disclosure. Each narrative contained elements of truth, yet all were interlaced with omissions, misdirections, or subtle lies. She leaned closer to Inspector Lestrade, speaking softly so only he could hear. Observe the eagerness of some to explain themselves fully. That often conceals more than it reveals. Those who rush to clarify are frequently hiding knowledge they fear will surface without their control. The inspector nodded slowly, although his eyes remained fixed on his notes, following the formal channels he trusted more than instinct. Miss Marple then called attention to minor interactions between the witnesses. Timothy, for instance, fidgeted whenever Eleanor spoke of the pumpkin's placement, and Mrs. Abernathy's gaze would flick toward Lydia whenever the Colonel's past misdeeds were mentioned. Even the gardener, seemingly impartial, shifted uneasily when anyone spoke of the east wing or the study door. To Miss Marple, these subtle reactions, the almost imperceptible tightening of a jaw, the brief avoidance of direct eye contact, the micro-movements betraying anxiety, were as telling as the words themselves. The physical expressions of guilt, uncertainty, or concealment were quietly illuminating patterns that could reveal motives and opportunity. By mid-afternoon, the sessions had begun to reveal the undercurrents of tension running through Abernathy Hall. It was not that anyone had committed a blunder or acted overtly suspicious. Rather, the subtle interplay of behaviours, minor contradictions, and carefully chosen omissions formed a lattice of deception. Miss Marple's keen attention picked up these signs. The half-truths, the evasions, the over-eager explanations, the slight misalignments between memory and observable facts. They painted a picture of a household under pressure, each occupant managing their own narrative while masking either fear, guilt, or both. When questioned further about the pumpkin itself, responses diverged. Some guests dismissed it as a harmless ornament, others hinted at an ill-timed joke, though no one could place it definitively. The Colonel's niece admitted that she had noticed it, but assumed her uncle had moved it himself, while Timothy insisted he had not touched it, though Miss Marple noticed the faint streak of wax on the edge, consistent with someone rolling it along the floor. perhaps even along the path he would have taken. Even minor differences in perception became significant. The slight variation in timing reported by different witnesses highlighted the fluidity of memory and the possibility of deliberate misdirection. Miss Marple also began to probe the subtle motives behind each person's statements. Mrs. Abernathy's insistence on remaining observant seemed not only protective, but also defensive, as if she feared blame might attach to inaction. Timothy's desire to present a perfect alibi suggested anxiety, possibly of guilt or complicity. Eleanor's hesitancy revealed fear, or perhaps loyalty misdirected. Lydia's vagueness implied detachment, but the precise avoidance of incriminating detail hinted at knowledge she had not yet disclosed. Even Mr. Hopkins's minor contradiction suggested a protective instinct, a subtle concealment intended to shield someone or something. Each reaction, Miss Marple realized, was a thread in a larger tapestry, a web of human motives intertwined with opportunity and action. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had assembled a mental map of interactions, contradictions, and potential deceptions. The voices of the household had revealed much, yet the full truth remained elusive, hidden beneath layers of conscious and unconscious misdirection. She could sense the careful orchestration of words designed to mislead or protect, the delicate balancing act between truth and secrecy. And though the full picture had yet to emerge, she understood that the next step would require careful observation, connecting the words with the physical evidence she had already noted, and discerning which hesitations, glances, and subtle contradictions carried the weight of real significance. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows that danced across the polished floors, Miss Marple stepped back and observed the household quietly. The subtle signs of deception were emerging clearly now, the eagerness to cooperate, the hesitation to speak fully, the fleeting expressions of anxiety. Each person was a part of the puzzle, and the interplay of their narratives suggested hidden motives that would soon be illuminated by patient, careful deduction. In the hushed tension of Abernathy Hall, the game of hidden truths was underway, and Miss Marple's eyes missed nothing. The voices of deception had spoken, and she had listened with the precision that would ultimately bring clarity to the tangled mystery. Miss Marple retreated to a quiet corner of the drawing-room as the last of the household members departed for a brief respite. She sat in a high-backed chair, hands folded, eyes narrowing slightly, as she let the afternoon's testimonies settle in her mind. The voices she had heard, the careful evasion, the over-eagerness, the subtle hesitations, were now woven into a tangle of potential motives. Each household member had reasons that could, at least superficially, justify a fatal action. Yet, as always, motive alone was not evidence. It was the patterns, the intersections of human desire, opportunity, and action that revealed the true shape of a crime. Mrs. Abernathy was first in the queue of motives to consider. Her composure and meticulous attention to detail might have concealed a simmering resentment. Though outwardly devoted to her husband, there had been whispers among the staff of long-standing friction over finances and social decisions. The Colonel had been known to wield his influence with an exacting hand, and Mrs. Abernathy, accustomed to quiet authority in her own domain, may have felt constrained, her desires subordinated. Miss Marple did not immediately conclude malice, but she catalogued the tension, the subtle imperfection in her recollections, the flickers of anxiety at mention of the pumpkin and the Colonel's past misdeeds. These could signal anything from genuine concern to latent grievance transformed into a motive under pressure. Timothy, the young nephew, presented a more complex puzzle. His youthful bravado and exaggerated alibis hinted at fear of exposure rather than mere mischief. He had been closely associated with his uncle's affairs, sometimes included in discussions that bordered on adult business matters. Could jealousy of inheritance or fear of reprimand have driven him? The careful route he might have taken through the hall, the possible contact with the waxed ornament, and the subtle timing inconsistencies all suggested a mind conscious of observation, yet willing to take calculated risks. Miss Marple noted that opportunity and youthful impulsiveness often combined with desperation in ways adults underestimated. Eleanor, the maid, posed a subtler conundrum. Her loyalty to the household was apparent, Yet the faint hesitation when questioned, combined with her over-earnest declarations, suggested hidden knowledge. Was her motive protective, aimed at shielding a family member, or personal, perhaps born of a slight, a long-simmering grievance, or fear of being implicated in a crime she had unwittingly facilitated? The maid's intimate knowledge of household routines meant that her actions, deliberate or not, could easily influence the events of the night. The residue on the window and her prior observation of the Colonel's correspondence could indicate more than mere coincidence. Lydia Fairchild, the visiting cousin, seemed initially detached, but the timing of her arrival and her careful avoidance of detail raised questions. She was not merely a bystander. Her knowledge of the Colonel's past, hidden misdeeds, duels, and financial disputes, could have provided motivation for intervention. Was she driven by revenge, by the desire to unearth secrets, or by fear of the Colonel's revelations affecting her own standing? Her composure, so carefully maintained, could have masked urgency, even subtle manipulation of the evening's events. Miss Marple knew that such visiting relatives often possessed a dual awareness, the facade of civility overlaid with acute attention to opportunity. Even the gardener, Mr. Hopkins, who seemed at first indifferent, revealed a potential motive in the form of protective loyalty. The faint inconsistencies in his testimony about the window suggested awareness of someone's movement or intention that he had chosen to obscure. Was he shielding a member of the household, or acting to protect an aspect of his own routine or pride? Miss Marple knew that those who appear peripheral can, in fact, influence outcomes more than expected, their actions subtle but decisive. As she examined these intertwined possibilities, Miss Marple began sketching a web of connections, visualizing how motive, opportunity, and knowledge intersected. The pumpkin on the Colonel's chest was not merely a theatrical flourish. It had symbolic weight, linking past events with the present crime. The anonymous note, the wax traces, the displaced furniture, the streak on the window, and the inconsistencies in timing all spoke of human manipulation, carefully executed to confound observation. The threads of motive ran along the same paths: jealousy, fear, revenge, and perhaps greed. Yet none alone explained the full tableau. Greed, for example, was an obvious thread. The Colonel had substantial assets, and his death would alter the inheritance and distribution of his holdings. But while this might implicate multiple members of the family, it could not easily account for the symbolic elements: the pumpkin, the cryptic letter, the careful placement of objects, or the timing of movement across the hall. That suggested a motive beyond simple financial gain. Revenge was subtler, intertwined with fear. The Colonel's past had left marks on the lives of others, disputes, duels, and decisions that had upended personal relationships. Perhaps the murderer had sought to impose a reckoning, not merely to benefit materially, but to deliver a measured consequence, carefully staged to signal knowledge, skill, and judgment. Miss Marple considered the note that warned of the smallest faces, the hollowed pumpkin concealing the key, the alignment of minor objects. All pointed to someone well-informed and deliberate, someone whose actions were a narrative as much as a crime. Jealousy, too, threaded through the household, subtle but pervasive. Timothy's desire for recognition, Mrs. Abernathy's suppressed frustrations, even the distant cousin's understated vigilance, all carried undertones of rivalry, perceived slights, and emotional ambition. The tension between observation and concealment, between the public face and the private intent, produced a complex mosaic of potential motives, each plausible yet incomplete. Fear, finally, connected many of these threads. Each household member seemed anxious, aware of potential scrutiny, conscious that secrets long buried might be revealed. Fear could drive evasion, exaggeration, or even indirect interference, moving objects, altering timing, or shifting perceptions to obscure truth. Miss Marple observed that the signs of fear were often subtle: a fleeting glance, a micro-expression, a hesitancy in speech. Yet when combined with motive and opportunity, they became powerful indicators of possible involvement. Miss Marple began sorting through the alibis systematically. Mrs. Abernathy's presence in the sitting room seemed verified, but left gaps in timing. Timothy's movements were partially corroborated, but the hall and its waxed ornaments suggested potential unsupervised passage. Eleanor's duties explained some movement, but not the streaked window. Lydia's observations were detached but attentive, hinting at awareness beyond her claimed presence, and Mr. Hopkins' actions were consistent with routine, but contradicted by minor evidence. No single narrative could account for the totality of the crime, reinforcing the notion that multiple intersecting motives and actions were at play. The web of deception, once sketched, revealed patterns emerging from apparent chaos. Opportunity intertwined with knowledge. Who knew which doors would remain locked, which objects might be displaced? Who understood the Colonel's habits and vulnerabilities? Motive intersected with personality. Jealousy, greed, revenge, and fear layered atop one another, each influence colouring the behaviour of individuals in subtle, sometimes contradictory ways. Miss Marple saw that the complexity was deliberate. The perpetrator had crafted the scene and narrative with care, aware that a simple explanation would be too easily dismissed, and that misdirection would exploit human tendencies toward assumption and trust. As evening approached, the detective's mind continued to untangle these threads, connecting motives to actions, words to gestures, and past grievances to present consequences. She began to perceive a pattern. The crime was not merely a spontaneous act of passion or opportunism. It was orchestrated, symbolic, and precise, aimed to manipulate perception while exposing hidden truths. The motives, though varied and sometimes overlapping, coalesced around a central awareness. The Colonel's death served multiple purposes simultaneously, offering opportunity, revenge, and the illusion of randomness, all masked beneath a veneer of ceremonial flourish. Miss Marple rose and paced slowly across the drawing room, considering the tangled threads she had observed. The human heart, she reflected, was rarely singular in its impulses. Just as the physical evidence intersected in subtle patterns, so too did the motives, weaving a maze that required careful navigation to discern the path to truth. And though the full solution remained hidden, the outlines of the crime were beginning to emerge from the shadows, revealing a carefully plotted tapestry of human desire, cunning, and the calculated deployment of fear. By the time candlelight began to replace the dimming afternoon sun, Miss Marple had constructed a preliminary framework of suspicion. Each individual bore a potential motive, each narrative contained partial truths, and each subtle observation, the scuff, the wax, the misaligned clock, the streaked window, hinted at deliberate orchestration. The maze of motives had been mapped, and though the path through it was not yet clear, she had the threads in hand to begin tracing the connections that would eventually expose not only opportunity, but the hidden intent driving the fatal night. In Abernathy Hall the tension remained taut, but with every observation and every careful deduction, the fog of confusion began to lift, revealing the first glimpses of a deeper, more intricate truth. The evening settled over Abernathy Hall like a heavy velvet curtain, the fading light casting long, sombre shadows across the floors and walls. Inspector Lestrade, bolstered by the meticulous notes of his assistants, had announced what he considered a breakthrough. A small, ornate letter opener had been found tucked behind the Colonel's desk, a tool that, according to the inspector, must have delivered the fatal blow. Its brass handle bore faint smudges of ink, and the inspector was certain that one of the household had wielded it in a fit of anger or calculated revenge. The news circulated quickly, the servants whispering it through the halls, and a sense of relief briefly replaced the underlying tension. Finally, it seemed, the crime had a solution. Miss Marple, however, remained seated quietly in the drawing-room, her knitting resting in her lap, but her hands idle as her mind raced. She had examined the letter opener earlier, noting the slight irregularities in its surface, the angle of the blade, the absence of blood traces, and the placement of minor scratches that suggested the object had been handled carefully but not recently used in violence. It was plausible, yes, that the weapon had been employed, but plausible did not equal certainty. There was something about the neatness of the discovery, the almost eager satisfaction of the inspector, that unsettled her instincts. The breakthrough felt too clean, too convenient, like a puzzle assembled before all the pieces had been considered. The household, sensing the shift in the investigation, buzzed with tentative speculation. Mrs. Abernathy drew a sigh of relief, suggesting that the shadow of suspicion would soon lift. Timothy, still flush with adolescent bravado, appeared slightly emboldened, no longer forced to craft alibis or dodge subtle observation. Eleanor the maid offered a polite, if careful, smile, relieved that attention might now settle elsewhere. Lydia Fairchild, however, remained poised, her calm expression unreadable, as if silently noting the implications of the supposed breakthrough without committing herself to satisfaction. Even the gardener, Mr. Hopkins, lingered near the periphery, stoic yet attentive, observing reactions with quiet interest. Inspector Lestrade wasted no time. He demanded that the household convene once more, and, armed with the supposed murder weapon, began his line of questioning anew. "We have the object that ended Colonel Abernathy's life," he announced. "The fingerprints, combined with previous testimony, point clearly toward—" He paused dramatically, looking at the group. "Young Timothy Abernathy." The declaration hung in the air, heavy with inevitability, and even Timothy's confident posture wavered. Whispers spread among the onlookers, some gasped, others exchanged furtive glances, while a few simply nodded, satisfied that the puzzle seemed solved. But Miss Marple did not speak. Instead, she observed. She noted Timothy's subtle tremor, the way his eyes darted toward the letter opener, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. It was not guilt that marked him, nor shock, but a calculation, a careful assessment of how to respond to authority, how to appear cooperative while keeping his own secrets intact. And then there was Mrs. Abernathy, who straightened slightly, yet avoided meeting her son's gaze, and Eleanor, whose hands fiddled nervously with the folds of her apron, betraying an anxiety unrelieved by the inspector's pronouncement. Lydia's eyes, calm and unblinking, seemed to weigh Miss Marple directly, an unspoken dialogue of understanding passing between them. Even the gardener's stance shifted minutely, his attention drawn less to Timothy than to the subtler currents of fear and expectation rippling through the room. Miss Marple rose and moved closer to the inspector. "Inspector," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet authority, "I would not be so hasty in declaring the case solved. The discovery of a weapon, even one associated with the study, does not tell us why, nor does it fully account for the events we have observed. There is more here than meets the eye." Lestrade frowned, the patience that had carried him through countless investigations fraying slightly. "But the evidence is clear. The letter opener was found near the Colonel. Fingerprints are present. The alibis conflict. Surely you see that this points to Timothy." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "It is true that Timothy has a presence near the scene, and perhaps even opportunity. But opportunity alone is insufficient. The movement of objects, the wax on the owl ornament, the streaked window, the misaligned clock, all these suggest deliberate orchestration. The weapon may have been placed to suggest guilt, to create a convenient narrative for those wishing to mislead or conceal. We must be cautious of a false victory." Lestrade, exasperated, waved a hand. "I'm not certain what else there could be. We have the testimony, the physical evidence, the motive." Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, taking in the anxious postures, the fleeting glances, the minute gestures that betrayed more than words. "Precisely," she murmured. "The testimony you rely upon is imperfect. The eagerness to exonerate or implicate, the subtle concealment, the overcompensation in explanations, all of these are hallmarks of a mind attempting to manipulate perception. And the murder weapon, if indeed it was used at all, is far too conveniently discovered, too neatly placed to provide certainty. Someone remains in the shadows, anticipating the misstep, content to let us claim a premature victory while they remain free to act further." A hush fell over the room. Mrs. Abernathy's hands tightened together, Timothy's expression hardened in quiet defiance, and Eleanor's eyes flicked toward the study, as though weighing the possibility of escape. Lydia's composure remained unchanged, but Miss Marple noticed a micro-expression, a near invisible tightening at the corners of her mouth, suggesting amusement, or perhaps concealed knowledge. Even Mr. Hopkins, silent as always, shifted slightly, as though acknowledging a presence in the room unaccounted for by formal investigation. The detective's instincts, honed over decades of quiet observation, told her one thing. The real criminal had anticipated the methods of the authorities. They had orchestrated a scene designed to mislead, planting evidence that seemed decisive while hiding the true mechanism, the subtle motions, the real opportunity. This was not the act of an impulsive perpetrator, nor one limited by circumstance. This was deliberate, patient, and cunning, a mind calculating multiple steps ahead, leaving clues that seemed to confirm guilt in one person while shielding their own actions. Miss Marple picked up the letter opener, examining it in the candlelight now gathering as dusk crept across the room. Its surface bore no blood, no residue consistent with a fatal act as she remembered the scene. The angle of the blade, the faint scratches, the way it had been positioned near the Colonel's desk, all suggested deliberate placement. Someone had ensured it appeared incriminating, yet careful scrutiny revealed it was a decoy, a lure designed to draw attention and conclude the investigation prematurely. She replaced the object on the mantel, stepping back to observe the household. The reactions were subtle but revealing, relief mixed with lingering anxiety, confidence tempered by uncertainty, gestures of composure overlaying tension. The criminal remained unseen, hidden in plain sight, perhaps even observing the unfolding drama with satisfaction. Miss Marple understood that this moment, the declaration of a solved case, was precisely what the perpetrator had intended. A false victory for the authorities, a momentary lull to mask continued calculation. By nightfall, the household had grown restless. Conversations were tentative, filled with careful politeness masking unease. Timothy appeared more cautious, aware that his relief was undeserved. Mrs. Abernathy's composure had begun to crack subtly under the pressure of observation. Eleanor's movements, once routine, now seemed measured and anxious, while Lydia remained poised but alert, the calm in her expression belying attentiveness to every word and gesture. Even Mr. Hopkins, who rarely spoke, seemed attuned to an unseen rhythm, watching for signals that might reveal the continuation of events. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner with her knitting bag open, reflected on the implications. A weapon had been found, and an innocent or convenient suspect identified, but the fabric of the crime had not been fully revealed. The interplay of human motives, greed, fear, jealousy, revenge, was still active, weaving through the household, waiting for a misstep, an opening, a shift in attention. The criminal had not acted hastily. Instead, they had constructed a scene designed to mislead, confident that authority would seize upon the simplest explanation while the true pattern remained concealed. She realized that the breakthrough declared by the inspector was a diversion, a temporary closure masking the ongoing threat. The criminal, secure in their knowledge of the household and the investigation, remained poised to exploit any lapse. The task, she understood, was not to confirm the surface evidence, but to penetrate the layers of deception, to observe what had been overlooked, and to anticipate the next move in a game played with patience, foresight, and subtlety. As the candlelight flickered across the room, Miss Marple's eyes rested on the shadows that stretched across Abernathy Hall. They were not simply the absence of light, they were markers of concealment, of calculation, of a presence that had yet to reveal itself. The so-called breakthrough was nothing more than a false victory, a pause in the narrative designed by a cunning mind. And though the household might breathe a momentary sigh of relief, she knew that the real resolution was still to come, hidden behind layers of observation, deception, and the quiet patience of a detective attuned to the smallest of signs. The night settled over Abernathy Hall with a hushed intensity, the storm from earlier fading into a rhythmic patter of residual rain against the windows. Candles flickered in their sconces, casting long, trembling shadows that made the hallways seem alive with secrets. Miss Marple sat in the quiet of the drawing-room, a notebook open on her lap, tracing the patterns of behaviour, minor inconsistencies, and carefully observed gestures she had recorded throughout the day. The false victory declared by the inspector still hung over the household, but her instincts whispered that the real story had not yet begun to surface. She found herself drawn back to the Colonel's study, retracing her steps with meticulous care. The displaced book, the wax traces on the owl ornament, the bent clock hand, each seemed to carry a message from the past, as though the crime itself were a cipher layered atop decades of concealed relationships and old grievances. Her attention fell on a small leather-bound ledger, tucked behind the more prominent family histories. It was dusty and overlooked, as if it had been deliberately hidden. Opening it, she discovered a record of minor disputes, debts and favours among the Abernathy family and their extended network, some dating back nearly 20 years. Names, amounts and terse annotations hinted at loyalties betrayed, promises broken, and quiet resentments festering in silence. One entry caught her eye, a note referencing Lydia Fairchild, marked with a date nearly a decade old. It documented a disagreement between Lydia and Colonel Abernathy over a family inheritance, and suggested that Timothy's father, who had died young, had been involved in mediating the dispute. Miss Marple's mind began connecting dots previously invisible. Lydia's careful observation, her calm detachment, and the subtle tension she displayed during questioning could no longer be seen as mere composure. Here was a thread of history, linking her directly to the Colonel in a way that illuminated motive, opportunity, and subtle, long-nurtured grievance. Turning the pages, Miss Marple noticed additional references. Eleanor, the maid, had been employed by the family for many years, witnessing arguments, disputes, and quiet settlements. Her hesitation during questioning now seemed more meaningful. Not only was she protective of her employers, but she may also have harboured awareness of past injustices, perhaps even secrets relating to Lydia's long-standing friction with the family. Timothy, young as he was, might have been aware of these histories too, absorbing tension and resentment like a child overhearing whispered grievances meant for adult ears. The present crime, Miss Marple realised, was not an isolated event. It was layered atop a lattice of historical interactions, long memories, and unresolved conflicts. The discovery of the ledger prompted her to consider the old, forgotten cases of the household. There had been minor incidents in the past, quietly resolved, that no outsider would have noticed. A missing heirloom from years ago, a hastily dismissed accusation of theft, a disagreement over inheritance, all seemed trivial at the time, but, in the context of the Colonel's murder, took on new significance. These events connected the household in subtle ways, linking grievances across generations, binding motives together that had appeared unrelated. Miss Marple understood now that the present crime was entwined with this history. The meticulous orchestration, the placement of objects, the false leads, and the overt displays of innocence were all designed to manipulate perception in light of long-standing tensions. She returned to the dining room, where the household had gathered once more. Conversations had resumed with a tentative civility, though the previous excitement over Timothy's supposed culpability still lingered. Mrs. Abernathy's composure remained firm, yet Miss Marple noted a tightness around her eyes that spoke of old fears, old resentments perhaps rekindled by the discovery of the ledger. Timothy shifted uneasily, his confident posture faltering as he sensed the connections forming, threads of past disputes now linking him to a broader network of influence, suspicion, and opportunity. Eleanor maintained a polite demeanour, yet the subtle twitch of her fingers hinted that she understood the historical ramifications more deeply than she dared reveal. Even Lydia, whose calm had seemed almost impervious, displayed a fleeting glance of recognition, a micro-expression that suggested awareness of her role in this long-standing web. Miss Marple observed interactions, noting how history seemed to govern present behaviour. Mrs. Abernathy's eyes followed Lydia whenever she spoke of the Colonel's habits, while Timothy's attention flicked to the places he had previously claimed to have occupied. Eleanor's careful positioning of chairs and objects now appeared deliberate, perhaps protective, perhaps obstructive. The gardener, too, seemed attuned to these historical undercurrents, his quiet watchfulness a reflection of years spent observing the household and its tangled relationships. Each person's behaviour was now illuminated by a historical lens. Actions, omissions, and gestures that had seemed trivial became significant, revealing connections and motives previously invisible. As Miss Marple considered the ledger alongside the previous observations, the wax on the owl, the bent clock hand, the displaced furniture, the streaked window, she began to discern a pattern. The crime was symbolic, layered atop historical grievances. The pumpkin on the Colonel's chest was more than a macabre flourish. It echoed past events, perhaps serving as a signal to those in the household aware of long-standing tensions. The anonymous letter now seemed part of this historical web, its warnings pointing not merely to present danger, but to knowledge accrued over years, communicated through subtle, coded gestures. Miss Marple's mind drifted to the ledger's most subtle annotations, brief mentions of favours denied, promises broken, and loyalty tested. These small entries now seemed like seeds of resentment cultivated over decades, influencing behaviour in ways no outsider could have predicted. The subtle hierarchy of influence, the delicate balancing of loyalties, and the quiet accumulation of grievances formed the backbone of motive. No single grievance, no isolated act of opportunity could explain the crime in isolation. It was the convergence of history, perception, and calculated timing that had produced the fatal event. By late evening, Miss Marple had begun drawing connections that altered her understanding of each person's role. Lydia's historical disputes with the Colonel provided motive for subtle interference. Timothy's inherited awareness of family dynamics could explain his nervousness without implying direct culpability. Eleanor's long service and observation of past events suggested protective behaviour rather than malice. Mrs. Abernathy's composed exterior masked long-standing tension, the undercurrent of which influenced her reactions, and even the gardener's quiet attention revealed a knowledge of household rhythms and historical interactions that might conceal or reveal evidence. Each of these threads, when traced backward in time, revealed intersections previously overlooked, creating a lattice of connections linking past and present. Miss Marple realized that the real solution lay not in the present-day objects or immediate actions alone, but in understanding the historical relationships, old resentments, and accumulated knowledge that had shaped behavior. The crime was an outcome not merely of opportunity, but of years of subtle maneuvering, quiet influence, and unresolved conflicts. The present act, though dramatic, was a culmination of long-buried tensions, enacted with a precision that demanded recognition of the past to understand fully. Sitting quietly as the household settled into uneasy silence, Miss Marple felt the weight of revelation beginning to coalesce. The crime, she understood, was a bridge between generations. The present actions had roots in old disagreements, past disputes, and the accumulation of human desire, ambition, and resentment over decades. The ledger had illuminated connections invisible to the inspector, and for the first time she could see the outlines of the true narrative, linking motives, opportunity, and behaviour across time. The shadows of the past were no longer distant. They were woven into the very fabric of Abernathy Hall, guiding the actions and concealments that had produced the Colonel's death. As candlelight flickered against the walls, casting dancing shadows across the room, Miss Marple made her silent calculations. The criminal, hidden among the familiar faces, had orchestrated not only a present act, but a historical echo, using knowledge of past grievances and relationships to manipulate perception. The breakthrough required patience, careful observation, and the threading together of past and present, a task only possible for one attuned to the faintest signals, the smallest omissions, and the long shadows cast by time. Abernathy Hall, she realized, was alive with history, and only by tracing the intertwining paths of memory and motive could the full truth finally emerge. Miss Marple spent the following morning in quiet contemplation, her thoughts occupied not by the obvious evidence, but by the invisible threads she had begun to trace between past grievances and present actions. The household moved about with a semblance of normalcy, but she could feel the tension beneath their carefully constructed facades. Something remained unresolved, a detail overlooked, a thread unpulled. The ordinary methods had produced nothing but a false victory. Now it was time for a subtler approach, one that relied not on direct questioning, but on perception, psychology, and the careful orchestration of circumstance. She decided to employ a tactic she had learned from years of observing human behavior, the power of suggestion. Rather than confront any one person directly, she arranged for a small gathering in the Colonel's study under the pretense of examining the crime scene one more time. The study was emptied of unnecessary furniture, save for the chair near the desk, the displaced books, and the ominous pumpkin that still sat, hollowed, as a macabre centrepiece. Miss Marple asked that the household members be present, ostensibly to recount their recollections, but her true aim was to provoke subtle reactions, to introduce ambiguity that might elicit more than words alone. She began by examining the pumpkin in plain sight, tilting it slightly so that its hollow interior caught the morning light. "It's remarkable how such a simple object can conceal so much," she remarked casually, her voice gentle, inviting reflection. "One might assume it was merely decorative, yet its placement that night suggests intention. Whoever arranged it had knowledge of the household routines and perhaps even foresight of others' movements." The effect was immediate. Timothy shifted uneasily, his eyes flicking toward the pumpkin, then away as if reluctant to appear unsettled. Mrs. Abernathy's lips tightened imperceptibly, a fleeting shadow crossing her otherwise composed face. Eleanor's hands, which had remained idle at her sides, twitched slightly, betraying a subtle tension. Lydia Fairchild, however, remained outwardly calm, her posture elegant, her gaze steady. But Miss Marple, ever observant, noted a barely perceptible narrowing of her eyes, a micro-expression that lasted less than a second yet spoke volumes about concealed attention. Even Mr. Hopkins, who rarely displayed emotion, leaned forward fractionally, as though sensing the significance of the object in ways he could not verbalize. Miss Marple's strategy was to allow the suspects to self-reveal through interaction with the environment rather than coercion. She continued, moving her gaze from one person to another with deliberate slowness, allowing silence to settle heavily between her words. "It is curious," she said, "how a simple placement, an angle, or a slight displacement can communicate more than one might intend. People often underestimate the power of subtle cues, movements, glances, and reactions that contradict spoken words." She invited each member to touch or examine the pumpkin in turn, ostensibly to assess fingerprints or any physical disturbances, but in reality observing their reactions. Mrs. Abernathy approached first, smoothing the pumpkin gently, then withdrawing her hand with a polite, neutral expression, though her fingers trembled faintly. Timothy handled it with exaggerated care, seemingly overcompensating, trying to mask anxiety, yet Miss Marple noticed that he hesitated before placing it back, as though recalling an unspoken detail. Eleanor's touch was hesitant, brief, almost apologetic, but the slight tightening of her shoulders suggested memory or fear rather than mere caution. When Lydia Fairchild finally approached, Miss Marple observed more closely. Lydia's hands hovered over the pumpkin, her expression neutral, yet there was an uncharacteristic hesitation, a pause before she lifted it. Her eyes flicked to the desk, then to the small ledger Miss Marple had previously discovered, and for a heartbeat her composure faltered. She inhaled slightly, almost imperceptibly, as though weighing the significance of revealing knowledge she had concealed for years. That momentary crack, though subtle, was enough for Miss Marple. The smallest gestures, the fraction of a second, the subtle change in breathing, the shift of attention were often the most revealing, far more so than elaborate statements or protestations of innocence. Miss Marple allowed the group to leave, one by one, observing their demeanour as they exited. The reactions she had recorded were consistent with her suspicions. Each person harboured layers of knowledge, fear, or restraint. But it was Lydia's reaction that had offered the most promising insight. The hesitation, the fleeting acknowledgement of the past, suggested she possessed information that intersected both historical grievance and opportunity. The subtle crack in her composure indicated awareness, calculation, and perhaps concealment, a carefully constructed performance designed to mislead casual observation. The afternoon brought another element into her method, a simple psychological test of memory and perception. Miss Marple placed several ordinary objects on the mantel: books, a small ink pot, a photograph of the Colonel, and an unrelated trinket, a brass key she had picked up from the hallway, and asked each member to recall the order in which she had positioned them. On the surface it seemed a trivial exercise, but Miss Marple understood that attention to detail, avoidance of eye contact, and micro-expressions under minor pressure could reveal subtle discomfort, lies, or preoccupation with guilt. Mrs. Abernathy recalled the order with precise accuracy, yet there was a micro-hesitation when the brass key was mentioned. Timothy's recollection was exaggeratedly confident, yet he stumbled over a small detail, touching the photograph briefly before speaking. Eleanor paused longer than necessary at the ink pot, betraying concentration that exceeded the simplicity of the task. Lydia's recollection was flawless on the surface, yet the briefest contraction at the corner of her mouth, coupled with a flicker of awareness toward the pumpkin, suggested that she was attempting to control a narrative that might expose her connection to both past and present events. Mr. Hopkins, as expected, was methodical and seemingly unaffected, though Miss Marple noticed that his gaze lingered momentarily on the ledger she had earlier reviewed, a subtle acknowledgment of its significance. The culmination of the exercise was telling. Miss Marple asked Lydia to recount her position in the study the night of the Colonel's death. Her answer, smooth and confident, nevertheless revealed an inconsistency. She described her movements in a direct path, yet Miss Marple noted the residual wax smudges on the floor, inconsistent with her claimed trajectory. The combination of environmental evidence and behavioral cues, the hesitation over the pumpkin, the micro-expression at the brass key, the eye flicker toward the ledger, and now the inconsistency in spatial recollection revealed a subtle but undeniable crack in her deception. Lydia had calculated, concealed, and orchestrated, but the pressure of observation and psychological nudging had exposed a small vulnerability in her story. Miss Marple paused, reflecting on the effectiveness of her unconventional method. By leveraging observation, suggestion, and minor psychological prompts, she had elicited information that formal questioning and physical evidence alone had failed to reveal. The human tendency to react, even minutely, to perceived oversight or suggestion provided insight into hidden knowledge, and in this case had highlighted Lydia's intricate connection to both the past grievances and present crime. The subtle interplay of gestures, hesitation, and attention offered clues far more nuanced than the blunt instrument of accusatory interrogation. By evening, Miss Marple had compiled her observations with care, noting each micro-expression, hesitation, and anomaly. The pattern was clear. While the other household members displayed minor signs of anxiety or memory slips, Lydia's reactions intersected with the key pieces of historical and environmental evidence. She had knowledge of the ledger, awareness of the pumpkin's placement, and a calculated approach to her own movements during the crime. The unconventional clue, the psychological test, the interaction with symbolic objects, and the careful observation of micro-expressions, had revealed a subtle truth that would guide the next steps of the investigation. As the E.C. household settled into uneasy quiet, Miss Marple felt a growing certainty. The criminal, previously concealed in layers of deception and historical entanglements, had now been partially illuminated. The reactions, though small and easily overlooked by casual observers, were clear to the trained eye. There was a connection between the present act and past grievances, and Lydia Fairchild, with her calm exterior and fleeting cracks in composure, had emerged as a central figure in both. In the flickering candlelight of Abernathy Hall, Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. The conventional methods had failed to pierce the veil of calculated deception, but the unconventional approach, observation, subtle suggestion, and psychological nuance, had produced a breakthrough. The criminal remained in the shadows, but the cracks were visible now, and the detective knew that, with patience and precision, the truth would soon follow, exposed not by force but by the very reactions of a mind too clever to be entirely without flaw. Miss Marple awoke the next morning to a fog-laden Abernathy Hall, the mist curling around the tall windows and seeping through the corridors like a living thing. Her previous observations of Lydia Fairchild's subtle reactions had left her with a tentative direction, yet she knew the path to truth was rarely linear. With the household quietly stirring, she resolved to review the physical evidence one more time, particularly the pumpkin, the ledger, and the letter opener. She found, however, that her careful preparations had already been undermined. The pumpkin, once carefully placed on the mantel for her own inspection, was now missing. A chill passed through her as she scanned the room. It was not merely displaced, but gone entirely. Even the faint traces of wax on the floor which she had noted the day before had been cleaned, leaving no sign of its previous location. The brass key she had left on the mantel had vanished as well. The ledger remained, but a few pages, particularly those referencing Lydia and past family disputes, had been removed, leaving ragged edges as evidence of deliberate tampering. A sudden realization struck her. Someone was actively working against her. The careful patterns she had begun to discern, The minor cracks in Lydia's composure all now risked being obscured by deliberate interference. The criminal, aware that their orchestration was close to exposure, was taking steps to eliminate traces that could connect them definitively to the crime. The stakes had risen sharply. Trust within the household could no longer be assumed. Anyone might have acted, and the removal of evidence suggested an intimate knowledge of the investigation's direction. Miss Marple moved quietly through the study, her eyes examining surfaces, corners, and overlooked spaces. The letter opener remained, still resting innocuously on the desk, but even it seemed to bear the faint weight of new uncertainty. The ledger's remaining pages were carefully aligned, though gaps indicated selective removal. She traced her fingers over the surfaces, noting the absence of dust in unusual areas and subtle disturbances in the floor near the fireplace. Someone had been here after her morning arrival, deliberately altering the scene to mislead or conceal. She called for Timothy and Eleanor, ostensibly to assist in cataloguing the remaining evidence. Their reactions were instructive. Timothy's expression wavered for just a fraction of a second before he masked it, while Eleanor's hands fidgeted in a way that suggested internal conflict, though she spoke carefully. Miss Marple observed the smallest cues, the tone of their voices, the choice of words, the direction of their gaze, and the hesitations embedded in otherwise natural speech. The removal of evidence had not gone unnoticed by them, and each displayed a subtle response betraying either fear, guilt, or protective instinct. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had reviewed the remaining ledger, noting that while several pages had been torn, the order of events and the specific references left intact still pointed to the long-standing disputes and grievances. She recognized the tampering as a calculated act. Someone had chosen carefully which pages to remove, attempting to erase connections that implicated themselves while leaving innocuous details that would mislead others. The criminal's understanding of what Miss Marple would deem significant revealed knowledge of her methods, an unsettling indication of their cleverness and audacity. The absence of the pumpkin, the missing ledger pages, and the vanished brass key collectively represented more than mere interference. They signalled intention. The perpetrator sought to bury the truth before it could be revealed, confident that physical erasure could suffice to deflect suspicion. Yet Miss Marple's observations suggested otherwise. The subtleties of human behaviour, the traces left in haste or carelessness, and the patterns of interaction provided evidence more durable than the objects themselves. The criminal had underestimated the acuity of a mind, trained to perceive the unseen, the implied, and the fleeting. To further probe the household, Miss Marple devised an informal test. She casually mentioned that the pumpkin had been carefully preserved for examination, and that the brass key had been instrumental in reconstructing the sequence of events. Her words were conversational, almost offhand, but she watched each member closely. The effect was immediate. Timothy's eyes flicked briefly to the empty mantel. Mrs. Abernathy's lips pressed into a thin line. Eleanor's posture stiffened, and Lydia's gaze met Miss Marple's with a quiet intensity that revealed controlled recognition. Even Mr. Hopkins, previously detached, gave a small nod toward the fireplace, as if acknowledging the hidden knowledge now at risk. Miss Marple understood that the thief of evidence had not acted alone. The precision of the removal, the selection of items, and the timing suggested intimate familiarity with the household's movements and the trajectory of the investigation. Someone had observed, calculated, and executed a plan designed to protect the criminal's identity. The disruption was not random. It was deliberate, aimed at frustrating her progress and creating doubt in the minds of others. Yet, as always, human nature left the smallest imperfections. Slight hesitation, a betrayed glance, or a lingering awareness of proximity that could be discerned with careful observation. She then turned her attention to Lydia Fairchild, whose reactions had repeatedly hinted at knowledge beyond the immediate. Lydia's composure remained remarkable, but Miss Marple noted the subtle shifts in her behaviour, the brief hesitation when discussing the pumpkin, the fractional contraction of her fingers, the near imperceptible glance toward the ledger's missing pages. These reactions, when combined with the knowledge of past grievances and opportunity, suggested that Lydia had either orchestrated or facilitated the removal of evidence. Yet the detective knew better than to rely solely on circumstantial inference. She needed corroboration, a subtle mechanism by which deception could be revealed without confrontation. To achieve this, Miss Marple arranged a minor reenactment of the study's layout, moving furniture and items back into approximate positions, as they had been the night of the Colonel's death. She observed the household members as they entered and interacted with the reconstructed scene, paying attention to those who displayed overfamiliarity with the arrangement or unusual attentiveness to minor details. It was here that Lydia's reactions became more pronounced. She corrected a slight misalignment of the desk, adjusted the angle of the fireplace tools, and instinctively glanced under the mantel where the pumpkin had been removed. The actions were subtle yet revealing, indicating both memory and involvement. Miss Marple documented each observation carefully, noting how Lydia's familiarity with the scene, the objects, and the ledger's contents intersected with human behaviour, psychological subtlety, and environmental evidence. The removal of the pumpkin, the brass key, and the ledger pages were not merely acts of concealment. They were tactical manoeuvres in an ongoing game of misdirection, executed to delay discovery of the truth. And while the evidence had vanished, the reactions of the household, the shifts in posture, the flickers of the eyes, the micro-expressions remained, providing clues more durable than the physical objects themselves. By late afternoon, the detective's understanding of the case had deepened. The vanishing evidence, rather than obscuring the investigation, had revealed the lengths to which the criminal would go to manipulate perception, conceal motive, and control the narrative. Trust within. The household was now a fragile commodity. The removal of evidence had sown doubt, anxiety, and suspicion, further complicating interactions. Yet Miss Marple recognized that this tension could also serve her. In moments of pressure, even the most calculated individuals falter, revealing truths hidden beneath layers of deception. She concluded the day with a quiet assessment of the remaining materials. While key objects had been stolen or destroyed, the patterns of behavior, reactions to suggestion, and interplay of past grievances and present actions provided a more enduring record of human intent. The stakes had risen. The criminal was aware of Miss Marple's perceptiveness and was actively attempting to hinder her, but this very interference offered insight into their psychology, methods, and priorities. The vanishing evidence had paradoxically illuminated the path forward, revealing not what had been removed, but the intentions and anxieties behind its removal. As evening shadows stretched through Abernathy Hall, Miss Marple sat by the window, her eyes tracing the silhouettes of the gables against the fading light. The missing pumpkin, the torn ledger pages, and the vanished brass key were no longer mere obstacles. They were indicators of an active, cunning mind operating within the household. Trust was tenuous, suspicion heavy, and the criminal's audacity palpable. Yet Miss Marple knew that human nature, in its smallest gestures and fleeting reactions, always left a trail. The game had escalated, but the detective's careful attention to behavior, history, and subtlety meant that the truth, though momentarily obscured, was edging closer to revelation. The evening air had grown heavy with an uneasy stillness, and the household of Abernathy Hall moved cautiously, each member aware that the removal of key evidence had unsettled the fragile equilibrium. Miss Marple, seated in her corner of the drawing-room, with the remnants of the ledger laid before her, was reflecting on the subtle revelations of the day. Each reaction, hesitation, and glance had further illuminated the complex web of past grievances and present manipulation. Yet even as she catalogued these details, a subtle foreboding tingled at the edges of her awareness, a sense that the criminal, aware of her scrutiny, was not yet finished. Her intuition proved prescient. A sudden, muffled scream echoed from the hallway leading to the servants' quarters, sending a ripple of alarm through the household. Miss Marple rose immediately, her mind sharpening into the precise clarity of urgent observation. Doors swung open as household members rushed to the source of the noise, revealing Eleanor the maid, trembling and wide-eyed, pointing toward the back staircase. At the foot of the stairs lay the body of Mr. Hopkins, the gardener, sprawled unnaturally, a gash across his temple and blood seeping into the worn carpet beneath him. Panic erupted. Screams, gasps, and shouts filled the hall. But Miss Marple's focus was already dissecting the scene, noting details overlooked by the panicked observers. The immediate conclusion of the household was that the criminal had struck again, perhaps emboldened by the earlier confusion, or to silence the one who had observed the subtle patterns within Abernathy Hall. Miss Marple, however, recognised a deeper calculus: the placement of the body, the absence of obvious signs of struggle, and the precise angle of the fatal blow indicated planning and anticipation. Whoever had removed the pumpkin and tampered with the ledger was not only avoiding detection but manipulating events to maintain control, demonstrating a strategic patience that underscored the danger. The drawing-room filled with tension as Miss Marple calmly directed attention. "We must be careful," she said, her voice measured but insistent. "The individual responsible is both aware and calculating. Haste will reveal nothing but fear. Observe, consider, and understand the pattern before we proceed further." Inspector Lestrade, arriving moments later, surveyed the body with grim determination. "This changes everything," he said, his voice tight. "The perpetrator is clearly still among us. Security must be tightened, and no one leaves until we have accounted for every movement." The household's anxiety intensified. Doors were bolted. Servants and family members were accounted for, yet the sense of control remained elusive. Miss Marple, observing quietly, recognised that the new act, the murder of the gardener, was not merely violence for its own sake, but a message. The criminal was not only active but several steps ahead, capable of anticipating scrutiny and manipulating perception. Miss Marple moved closer to the scene, examining the floor for subtle traces. She noted the slight smudges of mud near the back stairs, indicating that the perpetrator had entered or exited without drawing attention. The absence of fingerprints on the railing suggested care, the application of gloves or a deliberate wiping to obscure contact. Even the angle of the body, with limbs positioned as though in a moment frozen from a prior observation, revealed a meticulous attention to detail, almost theatrical in its precision. Every element of the scene was a controlled narrative, designed to elicit fear, misdirection, and hesitation among observers. Questions to the household revealed no additional insight. Timothy's face was pale, his earlier bravado extinguished. Though he continued to answer politely when spoken to, Mrs. Abernathy maintained her composed exterior, though Miss Marple detected subtle tremors in her fingers betraying anxiety. Eleanor, still shaken, recounted finding Mr. Hopkins only after he had fallen, her account precise but incomplete in the minutiae that Miss Marple knew could reveal discrepancies. Lydia Fairchild's response was calm, measured, but it was the subtleties of her posture, the slight narrowing of her eyes, and her attentiveness to every question that suggested she was both aware of the murder and satisfied that it served her purposes indirectly. The second crime fundamentally altered the investigation. The stakes were no longer limited to establishing motive and opportunity. They now encompassed immediate risk, the potential for further acts, and the understanding that the criminal's control of events had not been diminished by prior observation or interference. Miss Marple recognised that the perpetrator thrived on anticipation, calculating each move to maintain advantage, and that the removal of evidence, while initially frustrating, had been a rehearsal for more dramatic manipulation. Miss Marple paused near the ledger once more, considering the implications. If the missing pages had been intended to mislead, they had partially succeeded, but they also contained the history that now provided context for Lydia's subtle control over household events. The murder of the gardener was more than a violent escalation. It was a demonstration that the criminal had a deep understanding of human psychology and the rhythms of Abernathy Hall. The act was carefully staged to frighten, misdirect, and maintain invisibility, while subtly exposing those who might interfere with their plans. To probe further, Miss Marple devised a controlled test. She requested that the household return to the drawing-room, ostensibly to recount the events of the previous day and the night of the Colonel's death. Her aim was to recreate the sequence of interactions, the positioning of objects, and the movements of each member. Through careful orchestration, she hoped to provoke responses that revealed knowledge or guilt indirectly. As members moved through the study and the hallways, she observed their gestures, micro-expressions, and attention to detail. The removal of evidence the previous day now served as a silent benchmark. Any familiarity with vanished objects or their positioning would betray awareness of actions not publicly known. The test produced immediate results. Lydia's eyes repeatedly flicked toward the areas where the pumpkin and key had been removed. Her fingers brushed surfaces she should have had no reason to touch, and her posture subtly corrected details that others overlooked. Timothy displayed nervous hesitation. Mrs. Abernathy tensed when recalling specific moments, and Eleanor's recollection of minor spatial arrangements conflicted slightly with her previous statements. Even minor details, like the orientation of furniture or the angle of a rug fold, revealed layers of observation that each member had unconsciously recorded. The pattern was unmistakable. The perpetrator had orchestrated the events not merely to commit murder, but to maintain an edge, to manipulate perception, and to intimidate. Miss Marple realized with clarity that the new murder had a dual purpose. It was both a message and a practical move. Silencing the gardener who had observed patterns of behavior and reinforcing the criminal's dominance over the investigation. Yet this act also provided insight. The precise timing, the careful concealment of approach, and the deliberate staging of the body indicated a perpetrator who was meticulous but not infallible. Each small hesitation or micro-expression offered a glimpse into the method behind the malice, and the combination of historical grievances, removed evidence, and behavioral patterns pointed increasingly toward Lydia Fairchild. The household, meanwhile, had grown increasingly tense. Trust was fractured. Whispers and guarded glances replaced casual conversation. The knowledge that a second crime had occurred, seemingly at the perpetrator's discretion, created an undercurrent of fear, suspicion, and uncertainty. Miss Marple, however, felt a quiet confidence. The criminal's next moves would inevitably reveal themselves through action, reaction, or error. By observing carefully, correlating with past knowledge, and anticipating psychological patterns, she could not only solve the crimes but perhaps prevent further tragedy. As night fell over Abernathy Hall, the fog thickened outside, casting the windows into deep, undulating shadows. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room, cataloguing the day's observations with careful notation. The unexpected twist, the murder of Mr. Hopkins, had shifted the investigation dramatically, transforming it from a post-mortem reconstruction into a tense, ongoing confrontation. The villain, several steps ahead, had demonstrated cunning, patience, and the ability to manipulate both evidence and human perception. But Miss Marple knew that even the most careful planning could not fully anticipate a mind trained to notice the smallest detail, the slightest hesitation, and the subtle interplay between past and present. She allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, feeling the intricate web of motives, history, and observation tighten around the criminal. The danger was real, the stakes higher than ever, yet the pattern was emerging. Abernathy Hall, with all its shadows, secrets, and subtle signals, held the clues needed to expose the perpetrator. The second crime had escalated the peril, but it had also illuminated the path forward, and Miss Marple, with her patient observation and keen understanding of human nature, was ready to follow that path to its inevitable conclusion. The morning following the murder of Mr. Hopkins brought a brittle quiet over Abernathy Hall. The household moved with careful deliberation, each member wary of both observation and conjecture. Miss Marple, meanwhile, immersed herself in her habitual routine of methodical scrutiny. The chaos of the previous days, the Colonel's death, the vanishing evidence, and the gardener's murder had initially obscured clarity, but she knew that in disorder lay the seeds of a pattern. It was only a matter of patience, observation, and attention to the small, overlooked details that the truth would emerge. She began by retracing the movements of each household member during the preceding week, not merely to reconstruct timelines, but to uncover repetitions, habits, and unconsidered gestures. At first glance, nothing seemed remarkable. Timothy had assisted with minor chores, Mrs. Abernathy attended to correspondence, Lydia maintained her usual composure, and Eleanor moved quietly between duties. Yet Miss Marple noticed the micro-patterns, the way Lydia's hand unconsciously lingered near the mantel where the pumpkin had been, how Timothy's gaze often flicked toward areas recently altered, and the way Eleanor's movements skirted locations where previous incidents had occurred. Small, almost imperceptible consistencies were emerging. The key, Miss Marple realized, had been in plain sight all along, a minor, seemingly innocuous habit of the Colonel himself. He had always kept a habit of leaving small personal items in precisely the same location each evening, a habit so ordinary that none of the household members had thought to notice. Yet this consistency, combined with his preference for the fireplace as a reading spot, created a predictable environment that a clever perpetrator could exploit. The pumpkin, the brass key, and even the arrangement of the ledger were no longer random acts of misdirection. They were deliberate manipulations of the Colonel's routines. Miss Marple examined the fireplace closely, noting faint smudges in the hearth's corners. Dust that had remained undisturbed elsewhere was subtly shifted, as though someone had stepped there in deliberate avoidance of the main path. She recalled Timothy's minor hesitation when discussing his movements near the back stairs, Eleanor's unconsciously defensive positioning near the study desk, and Lydia's micro-expression when the pumpkin was mentioned. Individually, each seemed trivial. Together, however, they formed a trajectory, a trail revealing how attention had been directed, how routines had been exploited, and how the murderer had maneuvered within the household without detection. She compared the ledger to her observations. The torn pages that had been removed previously contained references not only to Lydia's past disputes with the Colonel, but also to minor, long-forgotten grievances that others had dismissed. Each removal was selective. The criminal knew which details were most likely to be used by investigators to establish motive. The pattern of removal itself mirrored the Colonel's daily routines, indicating that the person responsible had intimate knowledge of both the household and the Colonel's habits. Miss Marple's mind traced the chain of logic. Familiarity with past conflicts, meticulous observation of routines, and strategic removal of evidence. The criminal had created a controlled narrative, yet in doing so had revealed the blueprint of their manipulation through the smallest details. She then turned to the garden path leading to the back stairs, where Mr. Hopkins had been murdered. Tiny indentations in the soil, unnoticed by others, suggested a deliberate approach and retreat. The path was too narrow for casual traversal without leaving traces, yet only Miss Marple, attuned to the smallest irregularities, could detect the directionality of movement. The same pattern was visible in the subtle displacements within the study, the slightly askew books on the shelves, the faintly moved rug near the fireplace, and the misaligned chair. All were deliberate, minor adjustments intended to convey nothing overtly, yet collectively forming a map of opportunity and presence. A seemingly minor comment by Lydia during the initial questioning also now took on weight. She had remarked, almost as an afterthought, "The Colonel always insisted on finishing what he began, no matter the hour." At the time, the comment had seemed benign, merely an observation on the Colonel's personality. In the context of the emerging pattern, however, Miss Marple recognized its significance. Lydia had demonstrated not only awareness of the Colonel's habits, but also the ability to exploit them, a subtle hint at both knowledge and intent that had been embedded in conversation to gauge the detective's attentiveness. This small, offhand comment was a thread connecting behavioral observation to opportunity, revealing how the criminal had anticipated movement and responses within the household. Miss Marple mapped the sequence of events in her mind, correlating the Colonel's predictable routines with the removal of objects, the micro-expressions, and the minor discrepancies in the household members' accounts. A picture emerged. The perpetrator had studied the household for months, if not years, noting habitual locations, timing of tasks, and individual behaviors. The pumpkin's placement, the ledger page's removal, and the calculated staging of the gardener's death were all part of a coherent strategy, exploiting the patterns of daily life to mask criminal intent. Timothy's earlier nervousness, once considered the result of guilt or naivety, now seemed to stem from an awareness of manipulation rather than direct involvement. His reactions, constrained by inexperience, contrasted with Lydia's calculated composure. Eleanor's minor inconsistencies revealed loyalty conflicted with knowledge, suggesting she had observed but not participated actively. Mrs. Abernathy's subtle tension, though ostensibly protective of the household, reflected anxiety at realizing the criminal's sophistication. Each individual's behavior, when analyzed in concert with historical grievances and environmental manipulations, created a lattice of insight pointing inexorably toward Lydia. Miss Marple returned to the study, placing the remaining ledger on the desk. She examined the torn edges where pages had been removed, noting which entries remained and which were gone. The selective erasure aligned with Lydia's interests. Any evidence implicating her directly was targeted, while innocuous details were left to mislead. The criminal's intelligence and patience were evident, yet the pattern, once recognized, rendered the manipulation transparent. The seemingly innocuous habits, minor gestures, and offhand remarks now converged into a coherent narrative. Opportunity, knowledge, and motive all intersected in Lydia Fairchild's calculated actions. By afternoon, Miss Marple had drawn a detailed mental map of the crime's progression. Each movement, each manipulation, and each subtle interaction fit into the pattern. The Colonel's predictable routines, the selective removal of evidence, the placement of symbolic objects, and the careful orchestration of micro-behaviours. The past grievances, the psychological interplay, and the environmental evidence now coalesced, revealing not chaos but deliberate design. The criminal had relied on underestimation, believing that the ordinary and mundane would conceal intent, yet the detective's meticulous attention to habit, gesture, and subtlety had rendered the hidden pattern visible. As evening fell, Miss Marple gathered the household once more. She spoke calmly, guiding their attention to minor details. Book placement, the position of the hearth tools, and even Lydia's seemingly casual comment regarding the Colonel's habits. Each point she raised was accompanied by gentle observation, inviting reactions that revealed not only knowledge but intent. Lydia's composure, previously impeccable, now betrayed the faintest trace of recognition, a momentary tightening of her lips, a slight contraction of her fingers, indications that the pattern had been perceived and that her careful orchestration had been deciphered. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. The key to the case had always been in plain sight, in habitual routines, minor gestures, offhand remarks, and small environmental cues. What appeared at first to be chaos, the murder, the vanishing evidence, the gardener's death, was in truth a coherent pattern waiting to be recognized. By observing, connecting, and interpreting these subtleties, she had illuminated the framework of deception, uncovering the meticulous design behind the apparent disorder. The path to resolution was now clear, grounded in patterns that had existed all along, visible only to those who observed with patience, perception, and understanding. Miss Marple spent the early hours of the morning in quiet contemplation, tracing each thread of observation, gesture, and reaction she had catalogued over the past days. The pattern she had discerned, the Colonel's predictable routines, the subtle manipulations of objects, Lydia Fairchild's calculated interactions, was no longer merely an abstract framework. It pointed to an underlying force, a hidden motive that had remained obscured behind the more obvious grievances, financial disputes, and familial tensions that had distracted investigators from the deeper truth. She recalled Lydia's composure during each phase of the investigation, her subtle control over conversations and behaviours, and the precise timing of the actions she had taken. Removing the pumpkin, the brass key, and the ledger pages had not merely been about concealing opportunity or misdirecting suspicion. There was a precision and purpose to each act that suggested a psychological drive far beyond ordinary ambition. Miss Marple reflected on Lydia's history in the household, the lingering resentment toward the Colonel, the quiet observations over years, the meticulous maintenance of appearances, and the careful cultivation of an unassuming demeanour. It was this combination that had allowed her to act with both audacity and subtlety, ensuring that every step was calculated and that the household remained oblivious. Miss Marple turned her attention to the Colonel's personal habits, specifically his routines around his evening study and the handling of family documents. Lydia had been present, often ostensibly assisting or merely observing. Her interactions, while appearing benign, had been opportunities for careful study. The pumpkin, initially dismissed as decorative, had served as both a test and a signal. Its placement, manipulation, and eventual removal were exercises in both control and concealment, designed to probe the attentiveness of others while guiding perception. The act was far more than playful mischief. It was the first visible indication of a psyche attuned to manipulation and psychological dominance. It became increasingly clear to Miss Marple that the motive extended beyond the tangible. Money, inheritance, or simple revenge would have required far less intricacy. Lydia's meticulous orchestration revealed a desire not merely to achieve a material or social end, but to assert a form of intellectual and psychological supremacy. Each act, the disappearance of evidence, The subtle coercion of behaviour, the orchestration of micro-expressions, was designed to prove mastery over both people and circumstance. The murders, particularly the second act against Mr. Hopkins, were statements, calculated demonstrations that no observer, however vigilant, could interfere without being drawn into the criminal's carefully designed narrative. Miss Marple's mind traced Lydia's behavioural patterns alongside her historical grievances. Years of perceived slights, subtle dismissals, and the Colonel's rigid authority had fostered a sense of inadequacy masked by social grace. The initial crimes were not impulsive, but carefully premeditated. The Colonel's death, staged to appear straightforward, yet imbued with psychological subtlety, reflected an intent to exercise control over a figure whose presence had long overshadowed her autonomy. The gardener's murder, while ostensibly a necessity to silence a witness, also carried the signature of assertion, demonstrating mastery over both physical action and the reactions of others, reinforcing the criminal's dominance. Miss Marple considered the household dynamics. Timothy's nervousness, Eleanor's tentative observations, and even Mrs. Abernathy's restrained anxiety all played into Lydia's overarching psychological game. She had manipulated not only objects and opportunities, but the perceptions and emotional responses of the living, orchestrating events, so that fear, doubt, and uncertainty reinforced her control. The motive was therefore not simply to achieve an end result, but to exert influence over the very mechanisms of observation, thought, and trust within Abernathy Hall. Miss Marple also reflected on Lydia's selective removal of evidence. The pages she had torn from the ledger were chosen with precision, erasing material that might have exposed motive or method, while leaving inconsequential details to mislead investigators. This selective act was itself psychologically telling. It demonstrated a mind attuned to both concealment and the subtle orchestration of narrative, a desire to control not just the outcome, but the perception of those who might intervene. The criminal's careful balancing of visibility and invisibility was an expression of a deeper compulsion, a need to dominate the interplay between truth, deception, and human observation. To confirm her deductions, Miss Marple orchestrated another subtle test of observation. She invited Lydia to the study, under the pretense of discussing remaining family matters, positioning objects, and speaking of minor details with deliberate ambiguity. Lydia's responses, measured and controlled, nonetheless betrayed slight micro-adjustments, a tightening of the lips, a brief contraction of her hands, and a flicker of awareness at references to removed objects. Each small reaction, while almost imperceptible, aligned with Miss Marple's growing understanding of Lydia's motives. The acts of manipulation were as much psychological exercises as practical measures, testing attentiveness, asserting dominance, and confirming control. Miss Marple now recognized the full scope of the hidden motive. Lydia Fairchild's actions were driven by a profound need to assert intellectual and psychological supremacy over the household, and most importantly, over the Colonel himself. The perceived slights, the long-standing frustrations, and the subtle interpersonal manipulations had coalesced into a compulsive desire to demonstrate mastery. The murders and the manipulation of evidence were extreme expressions of this motive, revealing a psyche both meticulous and ruthless, capable of long-term planning and psychological nuance. Even the more minor elements of the investigation, previously dismissed, now illuminated aspects of Lydia's character and intent. The pumpkin's symbolic placement, the careful staging of the study, the interactions during the examination of objects, all were extensions of her motive, the assertion of control over both environment and perception. Miss Marple understood that the criminal had acted not merely to conceal or mislead, but to exercise dominance in a domain where intellect, psychology, and careful observation intersected. This deeper motive explained the audacity of the crimes, the precise manipulation of behaviour, and the orchestration of fear throughout the household. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple was confident that she had comprehended the hidden motive. She had observed the minutiae of behaviour, reconstructed the manipulation of routines and objects, and analysed the selective removal of evidence. The picture that emerged was chilling in its clarity. Lydia Fairchild was not merely pursuing material gain or revenge. She was driven by a complex, almost pathological need to demonstrate control and superiority, shaping the world and the people within it to her design. This understanding transformed the investigation from a pursuit of facts to a confrontation with psychology, where understanding the criminal's inner compulsions was as vital as uncovering physical evidence. The implications were stark. Any misstep could provoke further escalation, and the subtlety of Lydia's orchestration meant that even well-intentioned interventions could be manipulated to serve her ends. Miss Marple knew that the next steps would require careful planning, patience, and a continued reliance on observation rather than confrontation. The true motive, now revealed, demanded respect for the criminal's intelligence, caution in engagement, and anticipation of strategic manipulation. As evening shadows lengthened across Abernathy Hall, Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, reflecting on the revelation. The motive, psychological domination and the assertion of intellectual supremacy, was far more complex than simple greed or revenge. It explained the meticulous manipulation of events, the orchestration of micro-behaviors, and the audacity of two calculated murders. Understanding this hidden motive would allow her to anticipate Lydia's next move, to predict the psychological pressures she would exert, and ultimately to guide the investigation toward resolution. In the hush of the drawing-room, Miss Marple's mind traced every detail, every glance, every manipulation, recognizing that the key to solving the mystery lay not only in evidence, but in comprehending the depths of human psychology. The true motive, hidden in plain sight, yet obscured by deception and fear, had now been revealed, casting the investigation in an entirely new light and preparing her for the final, decisive confrontation. Miss Marple had spent the morning in careful preparation, arranging the study and library in a manner that seemed innocuous to the household, but was meticulously designed to reveal truth under controlled observation. Every object, every piece of furniture, every line of sight had been positioned to encourage subtle reactions, micro-expressions, gestures, and involuntary movements that might betray knowledge or guilt. She understood that Lydia Fairchild's intelligence and patience were formidable, but so too was the power of a carefully observed human pattern when applied with precision. Today, the final confrontation would unfold. She summoned the household to the drawing-room under the pretext of reviewing procedural matters and clarifying lingering questions regarding the Colonel's death. The tension in the room was immediately palpable. Each member of the household had grown increasingly aware of the scrutiny under which they were placed. Timothy sat stiffly, fingers intertwined, eyes darting nervously. Mrs. Abernathy's posture was formal, her expression carefully neutral, betraying only the faintest tension around the eyes. Eleanor, still pale from recent events, fidgeted with her apron, while Lydia remained poised, her expression calm and composed, betraying no obvious fear, at least on the surface. Miss Marple began by discussing minor details of the Colonel's habits and the sequence of events leading up to the first murder. Her tone was conversational, almost casual, but each phrase was carefully chosen to observe the household's reactions. She noted Lydia's subtle flicker of attention whenever objects or routines were mentioned. Her hand unconsciously shifted slightly toward where the pumpkin had been, her eyes briefly narrowed as Miss Marple referred to the placement of documents, and her lips pressed together in the slightest contraction. Each micro-reaction, though imperceptible to the others, confirmed what Miss Marple had long suspected. Lydia knew far more than she had admitted, and her control over the household had been both deliberate and meticulous. To increase pressure, Miss Marple introduced a controlled variable. She spoke of a hypothetical scenario in which evidence might suddenly be discovered, or a previously hidden observer might come forward. She noted with neutral tone that such revelations often prompted panic in the guilty, even those skilled at concealment. As she spoke, Lydia's attention sharpened, and her previously measured composure wavered just enough to betray alertness. It was precisely this heightened tension that Miss Marple had anticipated, the moment when psychological dominance could be observed and gently guided toward revelation. Miss Marple then turned to a more pointed discussion of the gardener's murder. She recounted the small traces in the soil near the back stairs, the careful staging of Mr. Hopkins's body, and the subtle alterations to the study environment that had initially misled investigators. As she described each element, Lydia's gaze shifted, betraying an awareness that she could not entirely mask. Miss Marple continued calmly, noting how small manipulations, misplaced objects, slight gestures, or the removal of certain documents were designed to obscure the perpetrator's true motives. She spoke not accusatorily, but analytically, allowing the weight of the observations to settle in the room. It was then that Miss Marple introduced the final piece of the trap, a reconstruction of the pumpkin's original placement and the brass key's position. She had secretly retained these items in a drawer, and their reappearance, positioned precisely as they had been before removal, was intended to provoke recognition. Miss Marple observed carefully as Lydia's eyes widened imperceptibly, a fraction of hesitation in her otherwise controlled demeanour. Her fingers twitched near the mantel, her gaze flicked repeatedly between the objects and Miss Marple, and her lips parted ever so slightly. These minute indicators were confirmations, small cracks in a facade that had previously seemed impenetrable. With calm authority, Miss Marple allowed silence to fill the room, watching for any further signs. Finally, Lydia shifted in her seat, her hands clasping and unclasping with subtle tension. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle yet unwavering. "Lydia, the sequence of events, the removal of objects, the precise timing of each incident, these are not accidents. You have orchestrated this with care, and each step has been deliberate, yet human behaviour leaves traces, and those traces have guided us here." A faint pallor spread across Lydia's face, her composure straining under the weight of observation. She made a sudden, sharp movement, rising slightly as if to interrupt, but Miss Marple's gaze held steady, calm, and unflinching. "There is no need to resist," she said softly. "The evidence is in your actions, your reactions, and your attentiveness to details that others overlook. We understand your motives, Lydia. You sought not merely to conceal, but to assert control, to dominate the narrative, to demonstrate mastery over both people and circumstance." For a brief moment, Lydia's eyes darted to the mantel, then to the desk, then to the floor, a sequence of rapid observations, each betraying internal calculation. Her lips trembled as she finally spoke, voice low but sharp. You think you understand. You cannot comprehend the necessity of order, the logic behind what had to be done. The colonel, the gardener, they interfered with the balance that had to be maintained. I did what was required. Miss Marple nodded, her tone patient and measured. And yet, in doing so, you left patterns subtle and consistent that have revealed both the acts and the intent. Intelligence and planning can conceal many things, but they cannot erase the truths inscribed in behaviour and routine. The need for control, the desire to assert mastery, it is all visible in your actions, Lydia. You have confessed without words, through the very measures you took to remain hidden. Lydia's composure fractured further, her hands tightening in her lap, her eyes darting to each member of the household. Panic, frustration, and the faintest hint of recognition that her careful orchestration had been unravelled showed plainly. In a last desperate gesture, she reached toward the desk, perhaps to seize a paper or disrupt the items, but Miss Marple's calm presence and poised observation restrained the moment. "There is no need," Miss Marple said gently. "Everything is already understood. Resistance will only deepen the consequences." A tremor of realization passed through Lydia, and she sank back into her seat, the fight giving way to a reluctant acknowledgement. You have seen it all," she whispered, voice quivering. "Every intention, every movement. You have seen the pattern." Her gaze, now meeting Miss Marple's directly, carried the mixture of fear, astonishment, and the grudging recognition of intellectual defeat. Miss Marple allowed a moment of silence to settle over the room. She understood that the confrontation had achieved its purpose. The criminal's intent, methods, and psychological drive had been revealed not through coercion, but through careful observation, controlled manipulation of environment, and patient attention to human behaviour. The room, heavy with tension, gradually relaxed, the household recognizing that the crisis, though still severe, had reached a turning point. With quiet authority, Miss Marple continued, addressing the assembled household. "The crimes, though extreme in execution, were born of a need to control and manipulate, to assert dominance over the environment and the people within it. Understanding this motive allows us to anticipate actions, prevent further harm, and ensure that justice can be served. Lydia, now visibly subdued, remained in her seat, her earlier poise replaced with a tremulous acknowledgement of defeat. By evening, the final confrontation had solidified the case. The household, though still unsettled, had clarity for the first time since the Colonel's death. Miss Marple, composed and vigilant, had not only exposed the criminal's identity, but also revealed the underlying psychological forces that had driven the crimes. Every observation, every subtle test, every controlled variable had culminated in this moment. The perpetrator confronted by the very truths she had quietly uncovered, unable to resist or manipulate further. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The trap had worked not through intimidation or accusation, but through patient observation, careful orchestration, and an understanding of human nature. Lydia Fairchild's actions, driven by intellect, psychological control, and the desire to assert supremacy, had been laid bare, exposing both the method and motive. The final confrontation had achieved its aim, ensuring that the truth, both factual and psychological, was now fully revealed, and that justice, measured and deliberate, could proceed without ambiguity. The evening had settled into an uneasy calm at Abernathy Hall. The household, though tense, had accepted the apparent resolution. Lydia Fairchild, exposed through meticulous observation and subtle psychological traps, was presumed to be the sole architect of the Colonel's death and the subsequent murders. Miss Marple had allowed the household a moment of respite, confident in her deductions, yet her mind remained restless. She knew too well that human behaviour and motives were seldom entirely linear, and the faintest irregularity could conceal a final, unforeseen twist. She lingered in the study, reviewing her mental map of events, tracing Lydia's interactions, the placement of objects, and the subtle cues that had revealed her manipulations. Everything appeared consistent. Motive, opportunity, and behaviour all aligned to confirm Lydia's culpability. And yet, a small unease persisted, a detail she had noted but had not fully explored. It was Eleanor's reaction during the reconstruction of the pumpkin and brass key. The maid had been pale and hesitant, but at a particular moment her gaze had flickered toward the desk with a recognition so brief it could have been dismissed as fear. Miss Marple recalled the way Eleanor's fingers had hovered over an object before withdrawing, a hesitation not mirrored by Lydia or the others. It was minor, almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple had learned not to ignore such anomalies. Unable to resist, Miss Marple requested Eleanor's presence under the guise of confirming household arrangements for the next day. The maid entered cautiously, avoiding eye contact, her voice soft and deferential. Miss Marple spoke gently, discussing minor details of the study and garden, observing Eleanor's responses with the practiced precision that had guided her through the entire investigation. As she subtly referenced the Colonel's study habits, Eleanor's gaze shifted, lingering slightly on the top drawer of the desk, a place where, according to Miss Marple's previous observations, Lydia had shown no interest. The subtlety of the glance, the almost imperceptible inhalation through the nose, suggested recognition, knowledge, or perhaps a memory long suppressed. Miss Marple's intuition sharpened. She asked Eleanor to recount her movements during the crucial hours surrounding the Colonel's death, speaking in a calm, conversational tone designed to provoke recollection without coercion. Eleanor's account was careful, initially consistent with prior statements. Yet when she described entering the study at dusk, her hesitation over a specific phrase, "I thought the pumpkin was already on the desk," caught Miss Marple's attention. The inflection, slight and fleeting, implied that Eleanor had seen something, or someone, manipulating objects in the room before Lydia's apparent involvement. Miss Marple allowed the silence to hang, watching for further cues. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly, her eyes darting briefly toward the mantel, then the hearth, then the top drawer of the desk. Miss Marple realized that the maid, long considered merely an observer, had possessed knowledge that was subtle yet crucial. There had been a second actor, someone who had manipulated elements of the scene, perhaps to frame Lydia, or to cover an entirely separate motive. The sudden realization sent a shiver through her. The case, which had seemed resolved, might conceal a far more complex truth. Carefully, Miss Marple asked Eleanor to speak freely, without fear of reprisal. The maid hesitated, then whispered, It was not all Lydia. I saw someone else, someone who moved the pumpkin first before Lydia ever touched it. I didn't think to mention it. I thought I imagined it. Miss Marple leaned forward, her mind assembling this new thread. Eleanor's admission suggested a deliberate attempt to misdirect suspicion, a subtle orchestration by a second individual who had operated in the shadows, unnoticed. Miss Marple probed further. Eleanor revealed that she had seen Mrs. Abernathy in the study during the early evening, moving quietly between the Colonel's desk and the fireplace, adjusting objects with precision. Initially, she had assumed Mrs. Abernathy was tidying or preparing for an event, but in retrospect, the movements had been too deliberate, too careful, too intentional to be mere housekeeping. The revelation was staggering. The woman who had maintained a facade of composure and propriety might have been the true mastermind, guiding events from behind the scenes while Lydia executed visible manipulations, unknowingly serving as a convenient pawn. Miss Marple's mind raced, reconsidering every interaction, every gesture, and every sequence of events. The composure Lydia had displayed, her careful psychological manipulations, and her execution of observable acts had indeed drawn attention and fit the emerging pattern, but the subtle orchestration of timing, the placement of minor cues, and the way obstacles had been anticipated now pointed toward Mrs. Abernathy. She had the experience, the access, and the understanding of both household dynamics and human behavior to manipulate events without detection. Lydia, brilliant though she was, might have been manipulated herself, executing a script written by another hand. The detective moved swiftly but quietly, observing Mrs. Abernathy without revealing her own realization. The matriarch's composure remained impeccable, but as Miss Marple subtly referenced the placement of the pumpkin and the timing of the gardener's death, a flicker passed across Mrs. Abernathy's face, a fraction of recognition, almost imperceptible. Her fingers twitched momentarily near a desk drawer she had closed too carefully. Her gaze lingered on objects that should have seemed irrelevant, and a faint tension around the eyes betrayed the effort to maintain control. Miss Marple noted each micro-reaction with the precision of a hawk circling its prey. It became clear, the final twist of the case lay not in what had been visible, but in what had been concealed in plain sight. Mrs. Abernathy, leveraging Lydia's intelligence and subtle aggression, had orchestrated the Colonel's death and the ensuing chaos to consolidate her own control. Lydia's visible manipulations had drawn suspicion, but the true genius behind the crimes had operated quietly, calculating each step, ensuring that observable actions served to misdirect investigators. The motive, too, took on a new dimension. Mrs. Abernathy's desire for dominance, informed by years of frustration and subtle resentment, had manifested in a psychological game of extraordinary precision. Miss Marple's approach was careful. She requested that Lydia remain in the drawing room while she spoke privately with Mrs. Abernathy, framing the conversation as a discussion of household logistics. Calmly, she outlined inconsistencies, behavioral traces, and patterns that could not be accounted for by Lydia alone. Mrs. Abernathy, at first subtle in her denials, showed the slightest shift in demeanour, the smallest hesitation. Miss Marple, with quiet patience, allowed each observation and inference to accumulate, applying gentle but unyielding pressure through implication rather than accusation. At length the matriarch's carefully maintained composure faltered. Her voice, measured at first, betrayed tension. You believe it was me," she said, voice low, almost a whisper. "But, Lydia, she acted with such determination, such presence. I merely guided, suggested. It was necessary." Miss Marple nodded, acknowledging both the truth and the subtlety of the admission. Mrs. Abernathy's manipulations, though less visible than Lydia's, had orchestrated the sequence, ensuring that the house's observed chaos aligned with her desires while masking her involvement. The final twist reshaped the investigation entirely. Lydia Fairchild, once believed to be the sole architect of the murders, had been both participant and pawn, executing visible manipulations while the true mastermind, Mrs. Abernathy, directed the underlying strategy with psychological acuity. Miss Marple, as always, had observed not merely actions but intentions, patterns, and micro-behaviours that revealed truth beneath the surface of appearances. The genius of the criminal lay not in overt acts, but in subtle orchestration, a reminder that even when a case seems resolved, human behaviour and concealed motives may always harbour surprises. By nightfall, the household had been quietly reorganised under Miss Marple's supervision. Lydia, still unsettled but relieved that the investigation had not implicated her fully, observed Miss Marple with a mixture of gratitude and astonishment. Mrs. Abernathy, subdued and aware that her careful control had been exposed, sat silently, the weight of her actions now fully revealed. Miss Marple, composed as ever, reflected on the final, unexpected twist that even the most carefully executed manipulations could not withstand patient observation, meticulous attention to subtlety, and the quiet power of a mind attuned to human nature. The case, long thought to be resolved, had revealed its final complexity, testing Miss Marple's skill and understanding to the utmost, and in that quiet drawing-room, illuminated only by the soft glow of evening lamps, the detective allowed herself the faintest smile of satisfaction, knowing that the truth, with all its layers and unforeseen turns, had been fully illuminated. The house was quiet, yet the tension that had gripped Abernathy Hall for weeks lingered in the air like a thick fog. The revelations of the previous evening, the exposure of Mrs. Abernathy as the true mastermind behind the Colonel's death and the subsequent murders, had shifted the household's understanding of events, leaving them simultaneously relieved and unsettled. Lydia Fairchild, though initially implicated, had been revealed to be both a participant and, unwittingly, a pawn. Now the delicate task remained, to ensure justice was served, or, at the very least, to establish the truth in full before leaving the matter in capable hands. Miss Marple began her morning by walking through the study, observing the placement of objects and the lingering traces of activity. The pumpkin, brass key, and remaining ledger pages were all returned to their original positions, though Miss Marple noted tiny irregularities, a slight misalignment of the ledger, a faint smudge near the fireplace, and a barely perceptible indentation in the carpet where someone had knelt. These small traces, previously overlooked, now carried weight. They were the silent signatures of the criminal, the evidence that had remained invisible to all but the most attentive observer. Gathering the household once more, Miss Marple addressed them in her calm, deliberate manner. "What has occurred in this house is more intricate than appearances alone suggested," she said. Her tone was gentle, yet firm, compelling attention. "We have been misled by what seemed obvious, by visible acts that suggested sole responsibility. Yet, as is often the case, the true story lies beneath the surface of action, in gestures, timing, and subtle manipulation." She paused, allowing the words to settle. The room remained silent, each person hanging on her every inflection, sensing the final unraveling of the mystery. She began by recounting the sequence of events as she had reconstructed them, carefully separating Lydia's visible manipulations from Mrs. Abernathy's guiding orchestration. Lydia's acts were apparent: the removal of the ledger pages, the positioning of the pumpkin, the subtle redirection of suspicion. Her intelligence and careful observation made her a convincing suspect, yet it was precisely her predictability, shaped by Mrs. Abernathy's guidance, that exposed her to scrutiny. She noted the household's reactions, observing Timothy's slight forward lean, Eleanor's attentive gaze, and Lydia's own expression of muted relief mingled with lingering unease. Miss Marple then highlighted the overlooked details, the micro-traces, the gestures, and the timing that had revealed the matriarch's involvement. The faint smudge near the hearth, the small indentation in the carpet, the careful misalignment of the ledger, and even Eleanor's brief hesitation and recognition were all pieces of a subtle puzzle. Each of these elements, Miss Marple explained, was a silent message, left unrecognized by those who focused only on the obvious. Mrs. Abernathy's genius lay not in overt acts, but in guiding circumstances and people in such a way that the crime appeared to be the product of someone else's ambition. Mrs. Abernathy, who had remained silent until now, shifted uncomfortably. Her hands twisted in her lap, and a faint tension was visible in her eyes. Miss Marple continued. The timing, the manipulation of behaviour, and the orchestration of opportunity all point to one who understood the household intimately. This was not a crime of chance or impulsive rage. It was a calculated assertion of control, a demonstration of mastery over both environment and human response. She allowed the words to resonate, giving each listener a chance to digest the implications. She then focused on Lydia's role, clarifying that while she had acted in observable ways, her participation had been manipulated. Lydia's cleverness and assertiveness made her appear to be the architect, but it was her very visibility, her consistent patterns and decisions, that allowed the true mastermind to remain hidden. The less obvious, the subtler, the more patient. The criminal who operates unseen is often the most dangerous. Lydia, now understanding the full measure of her own role, sat quietly, her gaze lowered, acknowledging both relief and the residual shock of her inadvertent involvement. Timothy, unable to restrain himself, asked, "But how did you know it was Mrs. Abernathy, Miss Marple? How could you see what everyone else missed?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, a twinkle of insight in her eyes. "It is a matter of observation and patience. One must notice not only actions but inactions, gestures and inconsistencies that seem irrelevant. Eleanor's brief recognition, the subtle smudge near the fireplace, the faint hesitation when objects were repositioned, these were not obvious to those who expected to see the crime plainly. They are the clues left by human behaviour itself, the signatures of intention that cannot be fully concealed. She recounted in detail the exact sequence that revealed Mrs. Abernathy's orchestration, her quiet movement in the study before Lydia touched anything, the deliberate placement of objects to mislead, the timing of her entrances and exits, and her subtle emotional manipulations of household members to create alibis and misdirect. Suspicion. Each point was tied to a physical or psychological clue that, in isolation, seemed inconsequential, but together formed a coherent explanation of the true mastermind's strategy. Despite the clarity Miss Marple had brought, a tension remained, an unsettling sense of unfinished business. Mrs. Abernathy, though exposed, had not been apprehended formally. The evidence was compelling, yet its subtlety meant that legal proceedings would require additional corroboration. The household could sense that justice, while intellectually resolved, had not yet been fully enacted. Lydia, for her part, understood her inadvertent role in the deception and expressed her gratitude for Miss Marple's careful judgment, yet there remained a shadow of guilt and unease over her unwitting complicity. Miss Marple reflected quietly on this unresolved edge. Justice, in its most formal sense, would follow due process, but human understanding had already identified the truth. "In such matters," she said softly, "one must sometimes separate immediate emotional satisfaction from procedural resolution. The truth, the comprehension of motives and actions has been established. Legal justice will follow, but it is the knowledge itself that prevents further harm and illuminates the pattern that might otherwise have remained hidden." She emphasized to the household the importance of observation and attentiveness. Had these subtle cues been dismissed, had we relied solely on appearances, the truth might have remained concealed indefinitely. Human behavior, even under manipulation, leaves traces. Micro-expressions, gestures, and seemingly trivial actions. These are the maps to understanding even the most carefully hidden intentions. The criminal believed she could conceal herself behind layers of manipulation and misdirection, but human nature leaves evidence, even in the most subtle forms. As the household absorbed her words, Miss Marple allowed a moment of reflective silence. The study, once the epicenter of confusion, now stood as a testament to patient observation and the revelation of truth. Lydia, Mrs. Abernathy, and the remaining household members understood that while legal outcomes might still unfold, the intellectual and moral clarity of the case had been achieved. Miss Marple's skill, rooted in attention to detail, understanding of human behavior, and patient analysis, had once again proven decisive. Finally, she addressed the lingering unease with gentle authority. The visible acts, the overt manipulations, and the apparent sequence of events are rarely the whole story. Truth often resides in subtlety, in the threads that seem insignificant until observed as a whole. We have uncovered the entire pattern, revealed motives, and seen intentions where others would see only action. Justice in this broader sense has been served, even if formalities must yet be completed. In the quiet aftermath, the household settled into a fragile peace, aware that the mysteries of Abernathy Hall had been fully illuminated, the truth had been revealed, the hidden clues identified, and the criminal's methods exposed. Miss Marple, ever composed and quietly triumphant, observed the subtle dynamics, noting the lingering tension, the relief, and the understanding that even when justice is theoretically served, the knowledge of human behaviour, both good and ill, leaves its own indelible mark. The night had nearly swallowed the estate by the time the last uniformed constables packed up their equipment and left. Rain slicked the cobblestones and the wind toyed with the shadows of the tall hedgerows. Silence returned to the place, broken only by the faint drip of water from the eaves. Inspector Pewbright lingered, his hat pulled low, coat collar raised, eyes sharp as ever. The crime was solved, at least in the eyes of the authorities. Statements had been taken, arrests made, and the household declared safe again. Yet Pewbright didn't move. He never walked away so easily. He had spent too long in the service to believe in neat endings. The patterns of human deceit rarely wrapped themselves with a bow. Instead, they frayed and bled, leaving threads that trailed into the darkness. Tonight was no different. His boots carried him back through the corridors of the house, past rooms still heavy with the stench of tragedy. The library was silent now, the grand clock ticking evenly once more. He paused before it. The shattered glass from the night of the murder had been swept, but he could still see the faint scratch where the minute hand had lodged itself unnaturally. A false time, a false clue, a staged performance, and it had worked. Almost. He lit a cigarette and let the smoke coil upward. The case had ended in confession, in tears, in what seemed a clean solution, but something gnawed at him. Too many words spoken in haste, too many silences at crucial moments. It was the silence that troubled him most. Silence, Pewbright had always said, was louder than lies. He walked down the hall toward the guest chambers, each door closed tight. Behind those doors, the witnesses, the suspects, had returned to their carefully cultivated lives. Yet one door was slightly ajar, and on the carpet outside lay something so ordinary it should have meant nothing, a playing card, face down. Pewbright bent, turned it over. The Queen of Spades. He remembered the whispers in the servants' quarters weeks before the crime, about a game of cards that had turned bitter, about debts unpaid, about secrets wagered and lost. But why was this here now? The card was clean, unstained, untouched by the dampness of the night. Placed, not dropped. Pewbright slipped it into his coat pocket. Another loose thread. At dawn, he walked the grounds. Mist curled low over the garden, shrouding the statues and gravel paths. The air was damp with the scent of earth. He found himself drawn to the family crypt, an ivy-choked structure at the far edge of the property. Its iron gate was rusted, though the lock shone bright and polished, as if touched only recently. He crouched, studied the disturbed soil near the threshold. Someone had stood here in the last hours, someone who still had business with the dead. The inspector's cigarette smouldered as he straightened. The case was closed, yes, but not complete. He thought back to the words spoken during the final interrogation. I did it. I alone. None other. The certainty had been rehearsed, almost theatrical. Too perfect. Pewbright distrusted perfection. He thought of the tears shed at just the right moment, the insistence that no one else was involved, lies wrapped in honesty. And now this card, this crypt, this whisper of something unfinished. The inspector returned to the house, his mind alive with patterns not yet fully drawn. He saw the shadows cast by chandeliers, the nervous flicker in the eyes of servants carrying trays, the way silence clung to the corners of the room. He knew the story wasn't over. The criminal may have been caught, but the crime itself stretched further, back into old debts, bitter grudges, and perhaps into another tragedy not yet written. He stopped at the study desk where earlier he had stacked the case notes. One page was missing, a statement from one of the lesser witnesses, an unassuming gardener whose words had seemed irrelevant, missing now as if swallowed whole. The inspector exhaled slowly, tapping ash into the tray. Cases like these didn't end. They lingered. They whispered. They stalked the corners of his memory and curled themselves into new shapes when he least expected. As he left the house, stepping once more into the rain-washed morning, Pewbright paused at the gate. He glanced back at the looming silhouette of the estate, its windows dark, its secrets smouldering. Somewhere within, someone was still playing their game, still holding their cards close to their chest. The Queen of Spades weighed heavy in his pocket, a reminder that though the world might sleep easy believing justice had been served, a detective's mind never rested so easily. He lit another cigarette, drew deep, and walked away into the mist. The mystery, he knew, had not ended. It had only changed its shape, and somewhere, perhaps very soon, another thread would tug at his sleeve, pulling him back into the shadows where truth still hid. Because in Inspector Pewbright's world, a mystery never truly ends. It only waits.